The first thing Gideon Hale noticed when he stepped outside that night was that he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The blizzard had come fast, the way bad things always did in Montana, without warning, without mercy, without any particular care for the lives it disrupted. 1 hour, the sky was the flat iron gray of early evening. The next, it was a white wall of screaming wind and snow that swallowed the world whole. Gideon had lived through 17 winters on this land, and he knew the signs well enough to have already brought the horses in, banked the fire high, and settled in for what he figured would be a long, miserable night of listening to the roof groan under accumulating weight. He had not figured on the gunshots. 2 of them, close together, coming from the direction of the barn. He sat up from his chair so fast the book in his lap hit the floor. His hand was already reaching for the rifle above the mantel before his mind had finished processing what he'd heard. 30 years of frontier living had wired certain reflexes into him that no amount of quiet ranch life could undo. He pulled on his coat with the rifle cradled in one arm, wrapped a wool scarf around his neck, and pushed through the front door into the teeth of the storm. The cold hit him like a fist. Wind-driven snow found every gap in his clothing immediately, biting at his jaw, his ears, the thin skin above his collar. He bent forward and walked, following the fence line he'd strung between the house and barn exactly for nights like this one, nights when you couldn't trust your eyes to tell you which way was forward. He found the barn door open an inch. That was wrong. He'd latched it himself not 2 hours before. Gideon flattened himself against the exterior wall, listened. Under the howl of the storm, he could hear something. Breathing, maybe. Movement in the straw. He counted to 3 and went through the door low and fast with the rifle up. Don't. The voice was a woman's, and it was steady in a way that told him she meant it. Don't come any closer. He stopped. The lantern he'd left hanging from the center beam was still lit, casting its orange glow over the familiar shapes of his horses in their stalls, his tack wall, his feed bins. And in the far left corner, half buried in the straw he'd piled for the horses, a woman was pointing a revolver at his chest with a 2-handed grip that didn't waver. She was wearing a man's coat 2 sizes too large, her dark hair plastered flat to her face, and she was bleeding, a dark stain spreading from her left side that had soaked through the coat and dripped into the pale straw beneath her. Behind her, pressed against the wall in the shadows, were children. Gideon counted them without thinking. 1, 2, 4, 6, 7. 7 children ranging from what looked like 4 years old to perhaps 14 or 15. They were all watching him with enormous eyes. None of them made a sound. "Ma'am," Gideon said, keeping his voice level. He didn't lower the rifle yet. "You're bleeding pretty bad." "I know what I am," she said. "Who are you, and what's the name of this property?" "Gideon Hale. This is the Hale Ranch. I'm the only one lives here." Her eyes moved over him, fast and assessing, like someone who'd learned to read people quickly and had good reasons for doing so. "You work for Victor Whitmore?" "Never heard of him." "You sure about that?" It wasn't a question. Gideon met her eyes. "Lady, I've been on this land for 17 years and I don't know anyone named Whitmore. Now you're bleeding through my barn floor and there are children behind you who look half frozen. I don't know what you're running from, and I don't need to tonight, but you need to lower that gun and let me help you or you're going to be dead before morning and those kids are going to be alone." Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, more like exhaustion breaking through the surface of something she'd been holding very hard for a very long time. The revolver dipped an inch. "If you're lying to me," she said, "those children are not your problem. They belong to no one except themselves. And if anything happens to me, you let them go wherever they want to go. Do you understand?" "Understood," he said, though he had no real idea what he was agreeing to. He lowered the rifle. "Well, her name was Clara Whitmore, or it had been, until she'd spent the last 3 months trying to make sure no one connected her to that name." She told him this in pieces, between shallow breaths, while he got her inside and onto the narrow bed in his back room and assessed the wound in his kitchen lantern light. The bullet had gone through the flesh of her left side, just above the hip. Clean entry, clean exit, which meant no digging required, which was the only piece of good news he had. The wound was several hours old and had bled steadily the whole time. She was pale in a way that worried him, and her pulse, when he checked it at her wrist, was faster than it should have been. "You rode like this?" he asked. Walked, she said. The horses gave out 2 days ago. He looked up. 2 days. We had some food, not much. She closed her eyes briefly. The children haven't eaten properly since... She stopped. Since Billings. Gideon left her for a moment and went back to the main room, where the 7 children were arranged with careful stillness near his fire. They'd accepted the warmth, but none of them had moved toward the kitchen or tried to take anything. The oldest, a boy of about 15 with serious eyes and a set to his jaw that belonged on someone twice his age, was watching Gideon with the measured attention of someone who'd learned that adults required watching. You the one in charge when she can't be? Gideon asked him. Yes, sir. What's your name? Noah Reed. All right, Noah Reed. There's a pot of beans on the stove from supper. Still warm. Cornbread wrapped in cloth on the counter. You know how to dish up food for children? Yes, sir. Then do it. There's a small one there. He nodded toward the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been older than 4, who was sitting very close to the fire with her knees pulled up and her eyes going heavy. Make sure she eats first. Noah moved without another word. Gideon went back to Clara. He cleaned the wound with what he had, whiskey and clean cloth. And she didn't make a sound through any of it, just gripped the edge of the mattress with white-knuckled hands and breathed. When he'd packed it and bound it as well as he knew how, he pulled up the single chair in the room and sat. The shots I heard, he said. That was you? I fired at a man who was following us. I don't know if I hit him. Her voice was thinner now, starting to drift at the edges. He's one of Victor's. They've been tracking us since we left Helena. Victor Whitmore. You're my husband's brother. Her eyes opened. They were dark, and whatever fatigue was pulling at her, her mind was still fully present behind them. My husband is dead. Victor killed him. And then he put a bounty on my head and told everyone I was the one who did it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Why? He asked. Clara turned her head and looked at the wall. Because of the children, she said. That. He let her sleep before she could tell him more. She was in no condition to explain anything, and he was in no condition to make sense of it, and the storm outside had climbed to a pitch that made the whole house shudder on its foundation. He spent the next hour making sure the children were fed, really fed, not just given a scoop of beans, but watched carefully until each of them had eaten enough. And then he figured out where to put 7 cold, exhausted, frightened children in a house built for one. The 2 youngest girls went into the back room with Clara on a pallet he made from spare blankets. The remaining 5, Noah and 2 other older boys, plus 2 girls of middle age, he settled in the main room near the fire, with every spare blanket and piece of heavy cloth he owned piled over them. He sat in his chair with his rifle across his knees and listened to the storm and waited to see if anyone would come through it. No one did. Not that night. By morning, the storm had lessened to ordinary cold, the sky gone pale and flat, the world outside rearranged under 3 feet of new snow. Gideon made coffee and watched the children reorient themselves to a kitchen, to warmth, to the simple fact of a solid roof. They were cautious about it, all of them, the way animals were cautious after being hurt, reaching for comfort, but flinching back at the last second, unsure if they were allowed. Clara woke late in the morning with fever. He'd expected it, a wound that old in those conditions, with no proper treatment for hours. Infection was nearly certain. He sat with her through the worst of it, keeping water near, getting her to drink when she was lucid enough, changing the dressing twice when the seepage worried him. Noah appeared in the doorway twice without being asked, and Gideon sent him away both times, not unkindly. She's going to be all right, Gideon told him, though he was only about 60% certain of it. She's been all right before when she shouldn't have been, Noah said. She's stronger than she looks. I can see that. Noah lingered. You're not going to send us away. It wasn't a question either. It was something else. The particular tone of someone who'd been sent away enough times to recognize when it was coming and was trying to understand what it meant that he couldn't identify the signs this time. Not in this weather, Gideon said. Not with her like this. After, I mean. Gideon looked at the boy for a moment. He had an honest face, this Noah Reed. Not innocent exactly. Nothing like innocent, but honest. The kind of face that had seen things it shouldn't have and was still trying to make sense of them without going hard. I don't know what after looks like yet, Gideon said. Let's get through today. By the second day, Clara's fever broke. By the third, she was sitting up, drinking broth, and beginning to tell him the rest of it. Her husband's name had been Edmund Whitmore. He'd been a man of modest means but considerable conscience, an unusual combination in the Montana Territory of 1887, where conscience was often the first thing a man traded away when times got hard. Edmund had grown up watching children come through the frontier towns with nothing and no one, discarded by circumstance or death or simple abandonment, and it had stayed with him in a way it didn't stay with most people. He couldn't fix the whole world, Clara said. He knew that, but he thought maybe he could fix the part of it he could reach. He'd started small, taking in a boy from Butte who'd been sleeping in a livery stable, then a pair of sisters from Missoula whose mother had died of fever. He and Clara together had built something over 5 years that didn't have a name exactly, but functioned as a home for children who had none. At its peak, they'd been caring for 11 children in a house that was genuinely too small for the purpose, with a network of neighbors and sympathetic townspeople helping to keep them fed. Victor never liked it, Clara said. Her voice stayed even, but Gideon could see the way her hands tightened around the cup when she talked about her brother-in-law. He thought Edmund was wasting money and reputation on people who'd never amount to anything. That's how he talked about them, like they were investments that wouldn't pay out. Victor Whitmore was, by Clara's account, the sort of man who had acquired wealth and influence through a combination of genuine intelligence and a complete willingness to do whatever was necessary to hold on to both. He controlled significant land interests across 3 counties, had deep ties to territorial politics, and was accustomed to having his particular view of how things should be treated as the only reasonable one. His view of the orphaned children of the Montana frontier was this: they were a resource. Child labor, Gideon said flatly. Placement contracts, he called them. He had connections with mine owners, large agricultural operations, a textile operation out of Butte. Clara met his eyes. He wanted to broker the children, match them to employers, collect a fee from both sides. He framed it as charitable work, giving children opportunity, but she stopped. But a 12-year-old in a coal mine isn't opportunity, and he knew that. When Edmund refused, Victor had given him time to reconsider. When Edmund still refused, when Edmund had instead begun making noise to territorial authorities about Victor's scheme, Victor had killed him, made it look like a robbery, gotten 2 men in his employ to testify that Clara had been arguing violently with her husband in the days before his death. The bounty was $50, which was enough in 1887 to motivate serious men. He got custody of the children immediately, Clara said. Petitioned to the court as next of kin, given that I was... She made a short, controlled movement of her mouth that might have been a smile in a different set of circumstances. Given that I was a murderess. But you had the children. Noah figured out what was happening before the hearing. He'd overheard one of Victor's men talking about where the children were going to be sent. She shifted, winced, pressed a hand to her side. He came to me at 2 a.m. and said we had to leave then or we wouldn't get another chance. He was 15 years old. He'd already packed what he could for the little ones. Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking about the boy in the doorway with his serious eyes. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 11 weeks, Clara said. Outside, while Clara slept, the children began to learn the geography of the ranch in the careful, incremental way of people who were afraid to assume anything would still be there tomorrow. The youngest was a girl named Maisie, who was 4, who had not spoken a single word since Gideon had found them, and who attached herself to Clara with the specific, desperate tenacity of a small creature that has learned proximity to one safe person is the only reliable protection against everything else. When Clara was sleeping, Maisie sat beside the bed and watched her breathe. When Clara was awake, Maisie was within touching distance, always. There were 2 other girls, Harriet, who was 10, with a practical manner and a gap where her 2 front teeth had been lost to a fall 2 years ago, and Celine, who was 8, and who had arrived at the Whitmore household from somewhere in Colorado with nothing but the dress she was wearing and a habit of cataloging everything she saw, murmuring quiet inventories of whatever room she was in. The boys were Noah at 15, James, who was 12, and who had the fidgety, combustible energy of a child who needed work to do or would find his own work, which was rarely good. Thomas, who was 9 and very small for his age, and who had attached himself to Noah the way Maisie had attached herself to Clara, and Samuel, who was 7 and who had, as far as Gideon could tell, decided to reserve all judgment on everything until further information became available. Gideon found them useful to have around, which surprised him. He hadn't thought about children much in years. He'd made his peace, or something like peace, something more like armistice, with the fact that his life wasn't going to include them, hadn't settled into that particular shape. He was 51 years old and had been alone on this ranch for 6 years since his wife Margaret had died of a fever that moved faster than anything the doctor in Choteau could outrun. He'd kept the ranch because leaving felt like a different kind of dying, and because the work gave the days a shape that he needed. But James, the 12-year-old, was in the barn by 8 in the morning, asking if there was anything that needed doing, and Gideon found himself walking the boy through the feeding routine before he'd consciously decided to. Thomas helped Noah carry in firewood. Harriet found the broom and swept the kitchen floor without being asked, then stood back and assessed her work with professional satisfaction. By the end of the 4th day, the ranch felt different in a way Gideon kept noticing and couldn't entirely name. On the 5th day, he rode into Choteau for supplies. He went alone, early, and he told Noah where he was going and approximately when to expect him back, which was the first time in 6 years he'd told anyone his plans. He needed flour, salt pork, more coffee, and medication. He'd looked at his supply of carbolic acid and decided he needed more, and Clara still needed willow bark for the pain she wasn't admitting to. He also needed to hear what people were saying. Choteau was a small town of about 400 people that had been growing steadily for a decade without ever quite becoming the thing it was trying to be. It had a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, a livery stable, a land office, a church, and the particular kind of social architecture that forms in small places. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and opinions traveled faster than the mail. Gideon bought his supplies and listened. The postmaster, a talkative man named Dobbins, was happy to fill silence, as he always was. Victor Whitmore's name came up inside of 10 minutes, not because Dobbins was bringing it up, because someone else in the store had brought it up first, a rancher from the South County named Hendricks, who was picking up seed supplies and had apparently just come back from Choteau after spending time in Great Falls. Whitmore's got men all over the territory, Hendricks was saying to nobody in particular. Looking for that woman of his brother's. Word is she killed Edmund Whitmore back in Helena. Bounty's gone up. 75 now. She got children with her, Dobbins said. Heard that too. 7 of them. Whitmore says he's the rightful guardian, wants them returned safe. Hendricks shook his head. Hell of a thing. Man loses his brother, and then his brother's wife takes off with the children. Gideon kept his face neutral and paid for his supplies and walked out. He stood in the cold outside the general store for a moment, looking at the street. The story had been shaped, carefully, professionally shaped, the way you shaped clay before it hardened into something permanent. Victor Whitmore's version had reached Choteau and would have reached every town of any size in the territory by now. Clara was a murderer, and the children were her hostages, and Victor was a grieving brother trying to do right by 7 orphaned kids. It was a good story. Gideon thought about that on the ride home. A man who could construct a story that quickly, and that convincingly, and that widely, was a man who had practiced this particular skill before. When he got back, Clara was sitting up at the kitchen table. This was the first time she'd been out of the back room under her own power, and the effort had put color in her face. Not good color, the color of exertion rather than health, but still. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts, which drowned her, and she'd braided her dark hair back off her face. She was eating cornbread. Maisie was on the bench beside her, very close, working on her own piece of cornbread with the focused attention of a child who takes food seriously. "You went to town," Clara said. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't entirely neutral either. "Needed supplies." Gideon set the bags down. "Heard some things while I was there." He told her what he'd heard. He watched her face while he told her. Watched the way it tightened, not with fear exactly, but with something like recognition, like a person being told something they'd already known was coming. $75, she said when he finished. That's what Hendricks said. Victor doesn't do anything by halves. She set down the cornbread. "Gideon, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as clearly as I can say it. All right, whatever happened before you found us in your barn is not your problem. Those 11 weeks are mine to carry. But from the moment you brought us inside, from that moment, It became your problem too, and I didn't give you a choice in that, and I'm sorry for it." She met his eyes directly. "If you need us to go, we'll go. I won't pretend I don't understand why you'd want that." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the main room, James and Thomas were arguing in the low voices of children trying to argue without getting caught. "Where would you go?" Gideon asked. "I'd figure it out. In February, in Montana, with a bullet wound that's 3 days from being infected again, if you push it." Clara said nothing. "I've been alone on this property for 6 years," Gideon said. He didn't say it with self-pity. It was just a fact he was presenting. "Before that, I had 30 years of watching this territory fill up with the worst kind of men and the best kind of people, and sometimes the same person was both. I know the difference between someone running from something they did and someone running from something that was done to them." He picked up the supply bags and began putting things away. "You'll stay until you can travel safely. We'll figure out the rest after." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know me?" "No," he agreed. "But I know Noah Reed, and that boy didn't learn how to be who he is from no one." That afternoon, a stranger's tracks in the snow stopped him cold. He'd gone out to the far field to check on a section of fence the storm had likely damaged, and on the way back he found them, a single set of footprints coming from the northeast, stopping at a high point where a man could see the ranch house and barn below, then turning back the same way. The tracks were already filling in with wind-blown snow, which meant they'd been made several hours ago, maybe before dawn. Someone had stood there and looked at his ranch for a while and then left. Gideon crouched and studied what remained of the prints. Large feet, heavy boot with an unusual tread, one heel worn down on the outside edge, the print leaving a distinctive mark. He filed it away. Then he stood and looked in the direction the tracks had come from, toward the northeast, toward the rolling white expanse of open land that led eventually to the Marias River, and beyond that to the settlements along the High Line. He looked for a long time. Then he walked back to the house without hurrying, because hurrying would tell anyone watching what he'd found. He didn't tell Clara about the tracks that night. She was better, noticeably better, the fever fully gone now, the color in her face natural rather than hectic, and she'd spent the afternoon sitting with the children and doing the particular administrative work of keeping 7 children's interior worlds from colliding catastrophically. He watched her manage a conflict between James and Noah over a card game with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for years, speaking quietly to each in turn, not taking sides, not performing Solomon wisdom, but just listening and then saying the plainest possible true thing. "You're both annoyed about something different than what you think you're annoyed about," she told James, who was 12 and therefore constitutionally certain that he was always annoyed about the exact thing he thought he was annoyed about. "Noah's in charge when I can't be, and you don't like that. And that's fair. But this isn't the moment to fight about it, because fighting with Noah uses up the time you could spend doing something you actually care about." James stared at her. "Like what?" "I don't know. What do you care about?" A pause. "Horses," James admitted. Clara looked at Gideon. "There are 4 horses in that barn," Gideon said, "and I've been managing their care alone for 6 years. If someone wanted to help with that tomorrow morning, I wouldn't say no." James's face rearranged itself with the speed of weather. "Before or after breakfast?" "Before. Horses don't wait on breakfast." "All right," James said, as if this had been his idea all along. Clara caught Gideon's eye across the room and something passed between them. Not quite amusement, something more complicated. The particular shared understanding of 2 people who have just managed a small human situation together and both know what that took. He told her about the tracks that night, after the children were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them. "One man," she said when he'd finished, "one set of prints. That could be a scout. Victor sends scouts first." She thought about it. Or it could be someone passing through who was curious about the smoke from the chimney. "Could be," Gideon said. "I don't think it is." Clara looked at the table. "How far to the nearest neighboring ranch?" "Adler to the west, 7 miles. Renstrom to the south, 9. And town, 11 miles on good roads, more in snow. So we're isolated. The ranch has always been isolated. I knew what I was getting when I bought it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What I need to know is, The man you shot at before you reached my barn. Did you see his face? Clara was quiet for a moment. He had a beard, brown, going gray, scar above his right eyebrow. She touched her own brow. He was riding a gray horse. You saw all that in a blizzard. I've been watching for Victor's men for 11 weeks. You learned to notice. He nodded slowly. I want to move the children's sleeping arrangements. If someone comes through that door in the night, I want them as far from the door as possible. Clara looked at him steadily. You're preparing for them to come here. I'm not hoping for it, he said, but I've been on this frontier long enough to know that hoping and preparing aren't the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have the revolver. I can shoot. I know you can, he said. I know it because you didn't. She looked at him. You could have shot me when I came through that barn door, he said. You had the drop and I had a rifle, and you still didn't shoot. You fired warning shots outside. You didn't shoot the man following you either. You said you didn't know if you hit him, which tells me you weren't aiming to. He met her eyes. You shoot to warn, not to kill. That's a choice. Clara's expression shifted, something moving under the surface. I've made enough choices that couldn't be taken back, she said quietly. I try not to add to the count. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not a blizzard, but the ordinary, relentless cold of a Montana February that didn't especially care what anyone inside was planning. Tell me about Edmund, Gideon said. She was surprised. He could see it. Not unpleasantly surprised, but genuinely caught off guard, as if she hadn't expected anyone to ask. He was a good man, she said. The words came out carefully, like she'd been protecting them. Not easy. He was stubborn, and he worried too much, and when he decided something was wrong, he would not let it go, not ever. Which was... She paused. Which was what got him killed, I suppose, but also what I... She stopped again. What you loved, Gideon said. Yes, she said simply. The coffee was cold and neither of them reached for it. My wife was practical, Gideon said after a moment. Margaret. She had no patience for sentimentality. She said the frontier burned it out of you if you had any sense. He turned the cup again. She had a garden, though. Every summer. Flowers, not vegetables. She said the vegetables were obligation and the flowers were her own business. She was not a woman who easily explained herself. But I think about that garden, and I think I understand her better now than I did when she was alive. Clara watched him. How long? 6 years this spring. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Same to you, he said. About Edmund. They sat together in the near silence of a house full of sleeping children and a wind that didn't let up, and it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was something. The particular specific comfort of two people who know what grief looks like and recognize it in each other and don't need to explain it. On the 7th morning, Gideon found a dead rabbit outside the barn. It had been placed there, not dropped, arranged with some care at the center of the barn door. A message, not a coincidence. He picked it up and brought it inside and said nothing about it to anyone except Noah, whom he took aside after breakfast. What is it? Noah asked, looking at the rabbit. Someone left it. Gideon kept his voice low. Deliberate. Could mean a lot of things. Could be a territorial marker. Some men do that, mark places they're watching. Could be something stranger. He looked at the boy. I need you to know that someone is watching this place. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not scared, Noah said. Then, a beat later, with more accuracy, I've been scared since October. I'm used to it. Fair enough. I need you to watch the children. Specifically, I don't want any of them outside alone, not even to the outhouse. Not until I know what this means. Yes, sir. And Noah, Gideon paused. If something happens to me, I need you to know that there's money in the floorboard under the left corner of the kitchen counter. Enough to get to Miles City on the stage. I've written a name there too. Lawyer named Harlan Price. He's honest, which is rare enough in my experience that I remember it. He'll help you. Noah looked at him for a long moment with those serious eyes that seemed to take in more than they should for 15 years of living. Nothing's going to happen to you, Noah said. Probably not, Gideon agreed, but probably isn't good enough when it comes to 7 children. Noah swallowed. Yes, sir. The rabbit was followed 2 days later by something worse. Gideon's south fence line, the quarter-mile stretch that ran along the road, had been cut. Not broken by weather or any animals. Cut cleanly, wire snipped at each post, a job that required tools and intent. He found it on his morning ride and sat on his horse in the thin winter light and looked at the damage and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was escalation. The rabbit had been a watch. I see you. The fence was a warning. I can reach you. He repaired the fence himself and said nothing about it at supper. Afterward, when the children were occupied, he told Clara. She received it with the particular stillness of someone who had already thought through the worst possibilities and was now being given evidence that they were materializing. Victor's men don't just watch, she said. They don't cut fences for fun. They're building a case for themselves, making sure of the territory before they move. That's how I read it too. When they move, it'll be fast and it'll be more than one man. She pressed her hand to her side, not the wound, just a habit, like touching something to know it's still there. What do you have for weapons? The rifle, a second rifle in the barn, revolver, my own, box of shells for each. 3 guns. 3 guns, he confirmed. Noah can shoot, Clara said. Edmund taught him. He's good. Gideon thought about asking a 15-year-old to take up a rifle in defense of people who were trying to kill them. He thought about the alternative. All right, he said. Clara looked at him with the directness she'd shown from the beginning, that quality of full attention that made you feel like she was actually seeing you, rather than the version of you it was convenient to see. You didn't sign up for this, she said. I want you to know I understand that. I signed up for it when I carried you out of that barn, he said. 7 days ago, in a blizzard. He met her eyes. I've had time to change my mind. I haven't. Something shifted in her face again. That thing he kept noticing, the exhaustion giving way for a second to something underneath it, something that was perhaps in the process of becoming something else. Why? She asked quietly. Gideon thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, the way you thought about things you'd been avoiding thinking about because the answer was complicated. Because a man who would murder his brother over money and try to send 7 children to coal mines, he said, is a man who's never run into anything that wouldn't move. And I've been on this land for 17 years and I don't move. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, I'm a good shot. I know you are, he said. I'm counting on it. 3 nights later, James heard a horse. He was already awake. James was often awake at 3 in the morning, a habit he'd developed during the 11 weeks on the run when sleeping too heavily was a liability. And he heard it and came and got Gideon without making a sound. Gideon was on his feet before the boy finished speaking, rifle in hand, crossing to the window. The moon was up, the sky clear for the first time in 2 weeks, and in the blue-white moonlight he could see the snow and the shapes of things clearly. 2 riders at the tree line, standing still, looking at the house. He watched them for 3 minutes. They didn't move. Then the nearer one raised a hand and made a motion, and they both turned and rode back the way they'd come. Gideon stood at the window and breathed until his heart settled, and thought about what it meant that 2 men had come to look at his house in the middle of the night and then ridden away. It meant they weren't ready yet. It meant they were still counting things. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat down and started figuring out what he was going to do. Because waiting was not a strategy. Waiting was just losing slowly. And Gideon Hale had not kept this ranch for 17 years in this country by losing slowly at anything. The coffee was cold by the time Gideon finished thinking. He'd sat at that kitchen table from 3 in the morning until the sky outside the east window went from black to the particular dark blue that preceded dawn. And by the end of it, he had something that might have been a plan, if you were generous with the definition of the word. It wasn't elegant. It had 3 or 4 places where it could go badly wrong without much warning. But it was better than sitting still and waiting for Victor Whitmore's men to finish their counting. The first thing he needed was information. Not the shaped, careful story that Hendricks had passed along in the general store. The real kind. The kind that came from people who had been there and had no reason to lie to him. He needed to know exactly what Victor Whitmore had built and exactly how he'd built it. Because a man who could construct a false narrative across an entire territory in a matter of weeks was a man with an infrastructure. An infrastructure had weak points if you knew where to look. The second thing he needed was allies. He'd spent 6 years telling himself he didn't need anyone, which was the kind of thing a person told themselves when they'd lost someone they needed and couldn't figure out how to need anyone else. But 7 children and a woman with a bounty on her head had a way of making a man revise his working assumptions. He was still sitting there when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She moved carefully. She was always careful about how she moved now, measuring each motion against what her side would tolerate. But she was upright, and her eyes were clear, and she'd braided her hair again, which he'd come to understand was what she did when she was preparing herself for something. She looked at his face, at the cold coffee, at the gray pre-dawn light coming through the window. "You saw something last night," she said. "2 riders at the tree line. They looked and left." She absorbed this without visible alarm, which told him she'd already considered the possibility in whatever hours she'd been awake. "You've been sitting here since, thinking." "About what?" He told her. All of it. The shape of what he was considering, the gaps he couldn't yet fill, the names he was turning over in his mind. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he was coming to appreciate, the way she listened to things all the way through before she responded. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, not against him, but against something internal. "Adler," she said, "the neighbor to the west. You trust him?" "As much as I trust anyone. He's been out here 20 years. He's had his run-ins with men who thought they could push him around." Gideon turned the cup in his hands. "He's not a man who likes being pushed." "And Renstrom? Different kind of man. Quiet, keeps to himself. But he's got a wife and 4 kids, and men like that, men with something specific to protect, they think about things different than men who've got nothing to lose." He paused. "I helped him pull his barn out of a bad snowdrift 2 winters ago. We haven't spoken much since, but he remembers." Clara thought. Victor's men will be working the towns first. That's where the information moves. They'll be asking about a woman and children, spreading the story, making sure anyone who sees us knows what they're supposed to think. She met his eyes. "But towns aren't everything out here. Victor knows territory politics and money and influence. He doesn't necessarily know frontier neighbors." "No," Gideon agreed. "He doesn't." "Then that's where we have something he doesn't." It was the first time she'd said "we" in a way that included him, and he noticed it the way you notice small shifts in weather. Not dramatically, but with the part of yourself that tracked such things because they mattered. "I'll ride to Adler today," he said. "I'll talk to Noah," she said. "He knows things I haven't told you yet." Adler's spread was 7 miles west through open country that was beautiful and merciless in equal measure, all rolling white hills and the occasional dark line of cottonwoods along a frozen creek. Gideon made good time on a clear morning, the kind of cold that was sharp rather than crushing, and found Adler in his barn doing what ranchers in February did, which was fix the things that had broken in January and prepare for the things that were going to break in March. Pete Adler was 62 years old, built like a man who had spent 6 decades taking what the land gave and not complaining about it. He had a gray beard he kept trimmed and hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than ordinary flesh, and a habit of looking at the middle distance when he was thinking that made some people think he wasn't listening, when in fact he was listening to everything. "Hail," he said when Gideon came through the barn door. Not surprised. Not much surprised Adler. "Coffee's inside." They went inside. Adler's wife, a compact, efficient woman named Ruth, poured coffee without being asked and then found somewhere else to be, which was her habitual response to conversations she'd decided were best had without her present. Gideon had always liked that about her. He laid it out for Adler the way he'd laid it out for Clara. Adler listened the same way Clara had, completely, without rushing it. When Gideon finished, Adler drank his coffee and said, "Whitmore, big landman, Helena area. I've heard the name." "What have you heard?" "That he's the kind of man who calls himself a land investor. And what he means is that he finds people with land they can't afford to keep, and he helps them lose it faster than they would have on their own." Adler's expression was the particular flat neutrality of a man describing something he found contemptible, but had decided anger wasn't worth the energy. "I heard he had some scheme going with child labor a few years back that got quietly shut down when someone in the territorial government got wind of it. Didn't stick to him, though. Smoothed it over." "That's him," Gideon said. "The scheme didn't stay shut down." Adler was quiet for a moment. Then, the woman and children are at your place now? Yes. How long? A week and some. Adler turned his coffee cup. You know what you're doing, Gideon. Not entirely, no. You know what I mean. A bounty's a bounty. Men who come looking for a bounty aren't usually interested in negotiating. I know that. Adler looked at him for a long moment. Gideon had known Pete Adler for 15 years, and he knew the look. It was the look of a man deciding something, turning it over, checking it from different angles. Ruth's brother is a deputy marshal out of Fort Benton, Adler said finally. He's a straight man, not a political appointment. I can write to him. How long for a letter to reach him and get a response? 2 weeks if the roads are good, 3 if not. 3 weeks was a long time, but it was something. Write to him, Gideon said. Tell him what I told you, but not where the woman is. Just that there are questions about the Whitmore case that need looking at. Don't put my name in it yet. Adler nodded slowly. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Gideon said, I'd appreciate knowing that someone else on this side of the territory is paying attention. Adler nodded once. That was all he needed to say. When Gideon got back, Clara was at the kitchen table with Noah, and the table between them had papers on it. Not many papers. 3 or 4 folded sheets that had been carried a long way and showed it, the creases worn soft, and the paper itself stained at the edges. Clara looked up when Gideon came through the door, and something in her expression told him these were important. Close the door, she said. He did. He hung his coat and came to the table and looked at what was on it. Letters. 2 of them. In the same handwriting. A man's hand. Educated, precise. And a third document that looked like a copied ledger page, dense with figures and names. Edmund kept these, Clara said. He knew what Victor was planning months before Victor moved on him. He made copies of correspondence he found. A ledger page from Victor's office. He got in there once when Victor was away and he took the time to copy what he found. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. He told me to keep them. He said if anything happened to him, these would be the only proof. Gideon leaned in and looked at the letters. They were from Victor Whitmore to a man named Aldous Crane in Butte, a series of practical, business-like messages discussing what Victor called placement arrangements for unattached minors currently residing in the Whitmore charitable household. The tone was the tone of a man discussing livestock, delivery dates, per-head fees, work classifications, length of contract. The ledger page showed payments, incoming, from names Gideon didn't recognize, and outgoing to 2 men whose names he recognized as having appeared in newspaper accounts of territorial affairs as associates of the land office. He was bribing officials, Gideon said, to smooth the foster and custody paperwork, Clara confirmed. In the territory in 1887, an orphaned child with no documented family had very few legal protections. Victor had identified exactly which officials controlled those protections and exactly what they cost. And the letters show that he knew the children were being placed in labor arrangements, not households, that he was profiting directly, that he characterized it internally as exactly what it was, rather than the charitable work he described publicly. She straightened the papers with careful hands. Edmund knew that if Victor ever came after them, these would be the only thing that showed the truth. Gideon was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger page, at the careful columns of figures, at the names and the numbers. These letters are dated, he said, 6 months before Edmund died. So Victor was already planning the child labor scheme while Edmund was still alive. And Edmund was already documenting it, Noah said. He'd been quiet the whole time, sitting across from Clara, his hands flat on the table. I helped him copy that ledger. He had me hold the paper steady while he wrote. His voice was even, but his jaw was tight. He knew what it meant if Victor found out. Gideon looked at the boy. 15 years old, and he'd helped a man copy documents that eventually got that man killed, and he'd been carrying that knowledge for 11 weeks. Noah, Gideon said. Sir, you did right. Then and now. Noah looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the table. His jaw loosened a fraction. Clara says these papers could help at a trial. If it gets to a trial. A lawyer named Harlan Price in Miles City, Gideon said. I mentioned him to you before. These papers, a lawyer like that would know what to do with them. Miles City is 4 days' ride from here, Clara said. In good conditions, with Victor's men between here and there. I know it. Gideon sat down across from her. Adler's writing to a deputy marshal in Fort Benton. That gives us a legitimate law contact that isn't tied to any of the officials Victor's been paying. He gestured at the papers. And these give us something to show him when he gets here. Clara looked at the letters for a moment. Then she folded them carefully, the way she'd clearly been folding and unfolding them for months, and put them back wherever she kept them, somewhere on her person under the oversized flannel. Victor's going to make his move soon, she said. He's not patient. The writers you saw last night, Jita, that's the final check before they come. That's how I read it. Then we have days, not weeks. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Her face had gone into that particular configuration, not quite expressionless, but compressed, everything going interior, like a fire being banked. Then we need to be ready, she said. Ready meant different things for different people, and Gideon spent the next 2 days watching the household organize itself around that word in ways he hadn't directed and couldn't entirely have predicted. Noah took to staying up later than anyone else, positioning himself near the window that gave the best view of the approach from the northeast, where the tracks had come from. He didn't make a production of it. He just quietly relocated after the younger children were asleep and sat there in the dark with the patience of someone who had learned the hard way that vigilance was not a temporary condition. James, who had been exercising his restless energy on the horses every morning, extended his range to include a systematic check of the barn's structural soundness that Gideon found surprisingly thorough for a 12-year-old. He reported back to Gideon one afternoon that the rear door of the barn had a hinge that was working loose. Needs a longer bolt, James said, with the authority of someone who had recently taught himself exactly what that meant. I found one in the toolbox that might do it, but I wanted to ask before I used it. Go ahead, Gideon said. James fixed the hinge. He did it in 40 minutes, the kind of job that would have taken Gideon 20, but it was done right. Harriet, the 10-year-old with the practical manner, had appointed herself the keeper of the youngest children's routine with an efficiency that went beyond her years. Maisie was still not speaking. She'd been silent now for as long as Clara could confirm, which was most of the 11 weeks, possibly longer. But Harriet had developed a method of communication with her that didn't require words, a system of gentle hands and patient repetition that kept the little girl from drifting into the frozen paralysis that sometimes overtook her when things got loud or uncertain. Gideon had watched Harriet do this without comment and thought that the 10-year-old understood something about how human beings worked that most adults never figured out. Celine, the 8-year-old, had discovered the small shelf of books Gideon kept above the fireplace and had worked through 2 of them in a week, sitting near whatever light source was available, reading with the focused intensity of a child who had found the one activity that made the world feel navigable. She asked Gideon one evening if he had any books about law. Why? He asked, genuinely curious. I want to understand what Victor can and can't do. Clara said there would be a trial. I want to know how trials work. He didn't have law books. He had a farmer's almanac from 1882, a novel by Mark Twain, a collection of natural history essays, and a hand-drawn map of Montana territory that he'd owned since before Montana was a territory. He gave her the almanac on the grounds that it at least contained factual information organized in an orderly way, and she accepted it without complaint and began reading it with the same focus she'd given everything else. Thomas, who was 9 and small, and who had attached himself to Noah's shadow, had begun following Gideon on his morning rounds with the thoughtful silence of a child who was learning by proximity. He didn't ask questions, he just watched, carefully, as if filing away the information for later use. Gideon had worked alongside silent people his whole life, and found that he didn't mind it. He started narrating what he was doing without making it obvious. This wire is for the fence, and this is how you test its tension, and this tool is called a fence plier because the man who invented it didn't bother with a more interesting name, and Thomas absorbed it all with the same quiet attention. Samuel, the 7-year-old who had appointed himself the judge of everything, continued his policy of careful non-commitment. He watched people. He watched Gideon especially, with the disconcerting focus of a child who had decided that adults were data sources rather than authorities, and was compiling his findings before reaching any conclusions. 2 days after Gideon's ride to Adler's place, Samuel appeared beside him while he was checking the rifle and said, "Are you going to keep us?" Gideon set the rifle down and looked at the boy. What does that mean, keep you? Like permanent, Samuel said. Clara says we're safe here for now, but now isn't the same as permanent. No, Gideon agreed. It isn't. So are you? He thought about how to answer this honestly, because Samuel was clearly a child who would notice dishonesty and file it in a particular folder, and Gideon didn't want to be in that folder. I don't know what permanent looks like yet, he said, but I can tell you that I haven't been trying to figure out how to get you out of here. I've been trying to figure out how to keep you safe. Those are different orientations. Samuel considered this with the gravity of a small judge weighing evidence. That's a careful answer, he said. It's an honest one. Samuel thought about it some more. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and walked away. On the 9th day, Victor's man came to the door. Not riders at the tree line this time. A single man who rode up the main path in broad daylight on a bay horse, dressed respectably, without visible weapons, and knocked on the front door like he was paying a social call. Gideon watched him come from the window and then went to the door. The man on the other side was perhaps 45, narrow-faced, with a traveling coat, and the particular manner of someone who made their living moving between situations. An intermediary, not a fighter, someone whose job was to do the talking before the fighting started. "Mr. Hale," he said. "That's me." "My name is Pendleton. I work for Victor Whitmore of Helena. I wonder if I might come in." "You might not," Gideon said. "What do you want?" Pendleton took this without offense. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who was used to not being invited in. "Mr. Whitmore has information suggesting that his late brother's wife and several children in his guardianship may have passed through this area recently. He's deeply concerned for their welfare, particularly in these weather conditions, and has asked me to make inquiries." "I haven't seen a woman and children," Gideon said. "Of course." Pendleton smiled, the careful smile of a man who'd been told not to push too hard, at least not yet. "Mr. Whitmore also wanted me to convey that he's very grateful for any assistance anyone in this area might be able to provide. Very grateful. He mentioned he'd be happy to compensate generously any individual who was able to help locate these individuals and ensure their safe return." "I haven't seen anyone," Gideon said. "I've been alone out here since before the last storm." "Well." Pendleton reached into his coat, slowly, carefully, the way a man reached into his coat when there was a rifle he hadn't seen yet somewhere, and produced a paper that he held out. "This is a flyer with the details. If anything comes to mind, Mr. Whitmore would appreciate it if you reached out to his office in Helena or, alternatively, to the Chateau Land Office, where his representative has a standing arrangement." He paused. "He mentioned something else as well." Gideon waited. "He said to tell you, and I'm conveying this exactly as he asked me to, that this is a family matter, not a legal one. Not yet. He'd prefer it stay that way for everyone involved." It was a threat, dressed in the clothing of a reasonable statement. Gideon had been alive long enough to recognize the cut of that particular garment. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Safe ride, Mr. Pendleton." He closed the door. Inside, Clara was in the back room with the children, having moved them there when she'd seen Pendleton coming up the path. She appeared in the kitchen doorway before the sound of Pendleton's horse had fully faded. "Pendleton," she said. "Philip Pendleton. He was in Helena. He handles Victor's—" She stopped. "He's not a violent man, but he's the one who comes before the violent men." "I know," Gideon said. "What did he say?" He told her, verbatim. Clara listened to the threat. The family matter, not a legal one, not yet, with her eyes going sharp and cold in a way he hadn't quite seen from her before. Not fear, something that had been fear long enough to become something harder. "He's giving you a chance to hand us over quietly," she said. "That's how I read it. And if you don't, then I imagine it becomes the other kind." She turned and looked at the wall for a moment, the particular look of someone doing fast arithmetic on bad numbers. "He's going to move before the week is out," she said. "He knows we're here. Pendleton confirmed it to himself, even if he didn't confirm it to you. He came to look at you as much as to deliver the message. He'll go back and tell Victor what he found." "What did he find?" Gideon asked. "A man alone." She looked back at him. "That's what he'll report. One man, no visible support, isolated property. Victor will think it's manageable. Let him think that." She studied him. You're not alone. No, he said. I'm not. He rode to Renstrom's the next morning. Lars Renstrom was a Norwegian man of 40 who had come to Montana with his wife Ingrid and a determination to make something real out of 600 acres of difficult land, and had been succeeding at it with the particular dogged persistence of a man who had decided that difficulty was not the same thing as impossibility. He had 4 children and a barn he'd rebuilt twice, and a winter wheat crop that had come in well the past 2 years, and he looked at Gideon across his kitchen table with the careful attention of a man who doesn't waste words. Gideon told him enough. Not everything. Not the papers. Not the full scope of what Victor Whitmore had built. But enough. A woman and children being hunted. A powerful man using money and influence to make the law work for him, instead of for the people the law was supposed to protect. Men riding onto neighboring property to watch and wait. Renstrom was quiet for a while when he finished. Ingrid, who had stayed at the kitchen counter rather than leaving, turned from what she was doing. She had a round, serious face and the kind of eyes that had seen a lot and hadn't been hardened by it. These children, she said. How old? 4 to 15, Gideon said. 7 of them. Ingrid looked at her husband with a specific expression that married people develop over years, the kind that transfers a complete argument in a glance. Renstrom turned back to Gideon. What do you need? Right now, just another set of eyes on the road between here and town. If you see riders moving in number toward my place, I need to know. And if it comes to more than that, Gideon looked at him directly. Then I'd be grateful for a neighbor who doesn't look the other way. Renstrom nodded, not enthusiastically. He wasn't an enthusiastic man, but with the solidity of someone whose yes meant yes. Ingrid's brother is in Choteau, he said. He'll hear things in town that we won't out here. I'll ask him to keep his ears open. Thank you, Gideon said. Don't thank me yet, Renstrom said. Thank me when it's over, shouted. On the 12th day, Clara walked the fence line. Gideon found her out there in the early afternoon, moving slowly because of her side, but moving, her coat buttoned against the cold, making her way along the south fence with her eyes on the road. He caught up to her and fell in beside her without saying anything about whether this was a good idea, because she was clearly going to do it regardless, and argument would have been wasted effort. They walked for a while in silence. I haven't thanked you properly, she said eventually. You don't need to. I do. You've turned your life sideways for strangers. It was already sideways, he said, in a different direction. She glanced at him. Margaret. 6 years of mostly sideways, he confirmed. This is at least sideways toward something. Clara walked and thought about that. The snow crunched under their boots. A hawk was working the field to the east, low and patient. Edmund used to say that grief was just love with nowhere to go, she said. I thought that was too neat when he said it. I've changed my mind. Gideon didn't respond immediately. They walked another 20 yards before he said, He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was, Clara said simply. Then, you would have argued with each other about everything. Why? Because you're both convinced that the right thing is the obvious thing, and neither of you has much tolerance for people who can't see it. She said it without criticism, more like observation, the kind of thing that was true and therefore worth saying. Edmund could never understand how people looked at those children and saw a problem instead of a responsibility. He took it personally, every time. That's not a flaw, Gideon said. No, she agreed, but it cost him. They reached the corner post of the south fence and stopped. The road was visible from here, but empty, stretching toward town in the white winter distance. They're going to come, Clara said. I've been telling myself we have more time, but I don't think we do. No, Gideon said. When they do, she turned to look at him. When they do, I need you to understand something. If it comes to a choice between those children getting clear and anything else, the children go. Whatever it costs. Clara. I mean it. I've been running for 11 weeks and I've made peace with what I'm willing to lose. I need to know you have the same clarity. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without difficulty. She was very good at that, at not blinking first, at waiting for the real answer rather than the easy one. The children go, he said. That's understood. Something loosened in her face. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a tension she'd been holding without being entirely aware of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said, which was what Renstrom had said, and she recognized the echo somehow and almost smiled. On the 13th day, Harriet brought him something. He was at the barn with James going over the horses, and Harriet appeared in the barn doorway with her hands behind her back and her practical expression arranged around something that was clearly important. "I found something in the hayloft," she said. James immediately looked at his boots in the way of someone who might know something about something in the hayloft. "James," Gideon said. "I was just keeping it safe," James said. "I found it in the snow near the south fence 2 days ago, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it somewhere." Harriet held out what she'd found. It was a leather satchel, small, scuffed, with a broken strap, the kind a man might carry documents in, or a field journal. Gideon took it and opened it. Inside was a folded paper, not a letter, a printed form, and a small notebook with oilskin covers that had been written in with pencil in a small, cramped hand. He unfolded the paper first. It was a writ, a territorial court document partly completed with Clara's name on it and the charge formalized in legal language. Murder in the first degree, Clara Elaine Whitmore née Sawyer, subject to apprehension and delivery to Helena District Court. There was a signature at the bottom that Gideon recognized as the name he'd seen on the ledger page Clara had shown him. One of the officials Victor Whitmore had been paying. The notebook was worse. It was a record, careful, dated, systematic, of the ranch's layout. The positions of the house, barn, fence lines. The times Gideon's lamp went on and off. The number and apparent ages of the children recorded in the clipped notation of someone writing for operational rather than personal purposes. The last entry was from 3 days ago. 7 children confirmed. Woman moving under own power. 1 man appears unaware of observation extent. Recommend 5 men. Approach from north and east. Move on next clear night. Gideon closed the notebook. "Does Clara know?" he asked Harriet. "No, sir. I came to you first." He thought for a moment about what it meant that this notebook had been dropped, whether intentionally or by accident, near his fence line. A dropped notebook was a mistake. Men who came to watch ranches in the middle of the night didn't make that kind of mistake without a reason, unless something had happened to them, unless they'd left in a hurry. Unless Clara's shot in the blizzard, the one she'd said she didn't know had connected after all. And a wounded man retreating fast might drop things. He tucked the notebook inside his coat. "Harriet," he said, "you did right. Don't tell the little ones." "I know," she said, with the tone of a 10-year-old who had been managing what information the little ones received for quite a long time. That night he sat with Clara and Noah at the kitchen table and spread the notebook out between them. Noah read it first, his face very still. Then Clara, more slowly, going back to the last entry twice. When she looked up, her expression was the one Gideon had started to recognize as her working face, not calm, but controlled, the face of someone managing a fear they couldn't afford to show. 5 men, she said. That's what he wrote. Victor doesn't send amateurs. Her voice was flat and precise. These won't be frontier drifters. They'll be experienced, organized, and they'll have the legal paperwork to back them up. The writ you found covers them, gives them the authority to take me into custody. The writ covers you, Gideon said, not the children. Victor will have something for the children too. He'll have everything covered. She pressed her hand to the table. He always does. Noah was looking at the map the watcher had drawn of the ranch. North and east, he said quietly. They'll put men at the barn to cut off the horses first. That's the standard. He stopped, as if catching himself saying something he didn't expect to know. How do you know that? Gideon asked. Edmund had books, Noah said. He read a lot. Military history, frontier law, accounts of range disputes. He said understanding how bad men operated was how you survived running into them. He looked at Gideon steadily. He gave me the books when he knew Victor was coming. He said I'd need to know how to think, not just how to run. Edmund Whitmore, who had been a man of modest means and considerable conscience, had apparently also been a man of very clear eyes about what his children were going to need without him. Gideon thought about a man carefully preparing a 15-year-old boy to survive in his absence, and felt a specific, wordless thing move through him that had no good name. All right, he said. If they come from north and east, that tells us something. It means they've decided the south and west approaches are secondary, which means that's where any retreat has to go. Toward Renstrom, Clara said. Toward Renstrom, he confirmed. Noah looked at the map again, then at Gideon. When? Next clear night, Gideon said. If the weather holds... He looked at the window, at the flat, dark sky outside. 2 nights, maybe 3. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, Thomas made a sound in his sleep, and then went silent again. We need to tell them something, Clara said. The children. Not everything, but something. They need to know that if I say move, they move immediately, no questions. They already know that, Noah said. Noah. They do, he said. We've been running for 11 weeks. They know what move means. Clara looked at him, at this boy who had been 13 when all of this started, who had woken her at 2 in the morning and saved every child in that house by understanding what adults around him were too frightened or too complicit to act on. Her face did something complicated and private. I know, she said quietly. I know they do. The next morning, Gideon rode the full perimeter of his property, not for fence inspection, for something harder to name, a final accounting of the land he'd held for 17 years, of the hills and the frozen creek and the dark patches of pine on the northern slope, the shape of the terrain under snow. He knew this land the way you knew a language you'd learned before you learned to read, not consciously, in words, but in the body, in reflex. He stopped on the high point of the south ridge and looked back at the ranch below. Smoke from the chimney, 4 horses visible in the paddock, and in the barn door, barely visible at this distance, a small figure moving, James, beginning the morning feed without needing to be told. He sat on his horse in the cold and looked at all of it for a long time. Then he turned and started planning the defense of it. He had the rifle and the revolver and a second rifle and a boy who could shoot and a woman who could too, and he had 2 neighbors who were paying attention, and he had a notebook that showed him where they were coming from, and he had something else that Victor Whitmore's men didn't have. He had 17 years of knowing every hollow and rise and shadow of this ground. He had 13 days of knowing these particular children, and he had whatever it was that had been growing quietly, without ceremony, between himself and the woman who had pointed a gun at him in his own barn and put it down because she'd decided somehow that he was worth the risk. None of that was nothing. It wasn't enough to count on, but it wasn't nothing. He rode back down to the ranch as the morning light moved across the snow and turned it briefly, brilliantly gold, the kind of light that didn't last and didn't have to. The clear night came on the second day. Gideon had known it was coming the way ranchers knew weather, not from instruments or calculation, but from the quality of the afternoon light and the way the temperature dropped too fast after sundown. The sky going hard and black and star-crowded, the kind of night that was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. He stood on the porch after supper and felt it and went back inside and told Clara. She'd been waiting for him to say it. He could see that in the way she set down what she was doing before he finished the sentence. They moved through the next 2 hours with the particular efficiency of people who have already made their decisions and are simply executing them. No discussion about whether, only about how. Gideon got the children dressed in their warmest layers, all of them, even Maisie, who did not resist but watched him with her enormous silent eyes as he buttoned her coat. Clara checked the revolver and handed Noah the second rifle with the straightforward manner of a person transferring a responsibility rather than a weapon. Noah took it without drama. He checked it the way Edmund had apparently taught him, which was correctly. You remember what I told you about the South Ridge, Gideon said to him. Follow the fence line to the corner post, then angle southwest toward the dark pines. Don't go straight. Angle. The terrain drops there and it gives cover. How long to Renstrom's from there? An hour in good snow. Maybe less if you push. Noah nodded. He had the rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, and his face had gone into the same controlled place Clara's went when she was managing something difficult. Not expressionless, but compressed. Everything interior. You're not coming with us, Noah said. It was not a question. Not first, Gideon said. Clara is. Clara looked up from where she was checking Maisie's coat buttons. No, she said. Clara, no. She stood. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge in it that Gideon recognized as the edge underneath all the other things, the thing that had kept her moving for 11 weeks. I'm not leaving you here alone. We discussed the children getting clear. We didn't discuss me. I need someone with the children who knows what they're running from. That's you. Noah knows. Noah is 50. Noah has been 15 this whole time, and he's done fine. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked up at him with the directness she always had, the thing that never softened even when everything else in her face did. I can shoot. You said you were counting on it. Have you changed your mind? He had not changed his mind. He'd hoped she'd changed hers. Harriet goes with Noah, he said after a moment. She knows how to manage the little ones. Yes, Clara said. And Noah takes them to Renstrom, and you and I stay long enough to make sure they get clear. It was a bad plan in the specific way that all plans that depended on everything going right were bad plans. But it was the plan she was offering, and she was offering it with the certainty of someone who had already considered every version of it and decided this was the one she could live with. All right, he said. Go up. He sent the children at 10 o'clock. Noah went first, checking the open ground between the house and the south fence line, and then came back and waved them out one at a time. Harriet went last, with Maisie on her back. The little girl's arms locked around her neck, her face pressed against Harriet's shoulder. Before Harriet went through the door, she turned and looked back at Gideon with the serious, practical expression that was her permanent condition. You'll come after, she said. Not a question, an instruction. After, he said. She nodded once and went. Gideon stood at the window and watched them move across the moonlit snow toward the south fence, 7 small shapes going single file with Noah in front, and felt something in his chest do something complicated and physical that he didn't have a word for. Then he turned away from the window because watching wasn't what was needed now. They came at midnight. Not from the north and east, as the notebook had said, from the north and east and the west simultaneously, which told Gideon 2 things: that there were more than 5 men, and that Pendleton had given them a better account of the ranch's layout than a single watcher's notebook. Someone had walked this property in daylight, probably days ago, probably posing as a passing traveler. He heard the horses before he saw them, the particular creak and shuffle of animals being held to a slow walk by riders who didn't want to announce themselves. He was in the dark of the main room with his rifle, and Clara was at the back window with the revolver, and they had not lit a lamp since 9 o'clock, letting the house look empty or asleep. East side, Clara said quietly. 2 horses at least. 3 on the north, Gideon said. Maybe 4. West? I can't see the west from here. A voice came out of the dark outside. It was a carrying voice, the voice of a man who had done this before and understood the mechanics of intimidation. Hail! This is Ward Kimball, duly authorized by writ of the Helena District Court to take custody of Clara Elaine Whitmore and the minors in her charge. You are harboring a fugitive. Come out and stand clear, and no one gets hurt. Gideon said nothing. Silence was information too. Hail! Kimball's voice again, patient, practiced. I've got 6 men in legal authority. You've got a woman with a bounty and a house. Think about what that math works out to. Clara appeared beside Gideon in the darkness. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, and she pressed her shoulder briefly against his arm. Not leaning, just contact, the kind that meant, I'm here. And then she moved to the side window and looked out. There's a man at the barn door, she said. He's trying to be quiet about it. He's not. He's cutting off the horses, Gideon said, which was what Noah had predicted, which meant Noah had been right about how these men thought. Clara, I need you to do something that's going to feel wrong. Tell me. I need you to go to the back room, the children's window. When I start talking to Kimball, you go out that window and you go south. She turned and looked at him in the darkness. You told me to stay, she said. I told you to stay long enough to make sure they got clear, he said. They're clear. You have the papers on you. You're worth more to those children alive and running than here. And you? I know this property, he said. I know the barn, the fence, the creek bed to the east. I've got exits they haven't mapped. He said it with more confidence than he felt, but not so much that it would ring false to a woman who'd been reading people for 11 weeks. I need you to go. She was quiet for 4 seconds, which he counted. Gideon. Her voice had changed, not softer, but stripped of the operational precision, down to something more basic. Don't die on this property. I was not planning to, he said. She held his eyes in the dark for a moment longer. Then she moved. He waited until he heard the faint sound of the back window, and then he went to the front door. Okay. He opened it and stepped onto the porch with his hands visible and the rifle lowered, which was not the same as surrendering it. Ward Kimball was about what the notebook had suggested, a professional, riding a dark horse, positioned centrally in the yard with the casual authority of a man who was used to being the most dangerous thing in the immediate vicinity. He was perhaps 50, lean, with a beard, and the kind of eyes that assess distances automatically. Two men flanked him, and Gideon could see the shapes of others at the barn and along the fence line. "Where is she?" Kimball said. "I told your man Pendleton I hadn't seen her," Gideon said. "Pendleton's not here. I am. And I'm telling you, we've had this property under observation for 10 days. So let's not do this part." Kimball's voice was almost reasonable, the specific reasonableness of someone who had already decided how the night was going to end and was offering a brief opportunity for it to go a different way. "She's here. The children are here. I have a writ that covers the woman and papers establishing Whitmore guardianship of the minors. Stand clear." "I want to see that writ," Gideon said. Kimball paused. He hadn't expected that. "What?" "The writ. You said you have one. I want to read it." Gideon kept his voice level. "I'm a property owner in this territory and a citizen, and any man who comes onto my land with a legal document can show it to me before I do anything. That's how it works." It was not, in practice, necessarily how it worked, but it was how it was supposed to work, and citing the supposed version was a way of slowing things down, which was what he needed. Every minute was distance for Clara and the children. Kimball studied him. Then he reached into his coat and produced a paper and held it up. "Come get it," he said. Gideon walked down the porch steps. He was aware of everything: the men at the barn, the men at the fence line, the particular quality of alertness in the horses, his own heartbeat, which was fast but not out of control. He crossed the yard and took the paper from Kimball and read it. It was the same writ he'd found in the dropped satchel, fully completed now, with a judge's seal at the bottom that Gideon couldn't verify was legitimate. The charge was murder. The authority was the Helena District Court. "This judge," Gideon said, "Hector Vane." "What about him?" "He a friend of Victor Whitmore's?" Kimball's eyes went flat. "Give me the document." "I'm not done reading it." "Yes," Kimball said, "you are." The man to Kimball's left moved his horse a step forward, and the barn door opened behind Gideon with a sound that told him someone had come out of it from the inside, which meant they'd already been in there, which meant they'd gotten to his horses. He did the calculations in the 2 seconds he had and arrived at a conclusion he didn't like. "She's not here," Gideon said. "Gideon." Kimball's expression changed. Not much, but enough. "Search the house," he said to the man on his right, without breaking eye contact with Gideon. "I said she's not here." Gideon let the weight of it land. "She was. She left 2 hours ago. You've been watching the approach roads. She went across country." Kimball looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way professionals read people. Gideon kept his face neutral and let him read what there was. "You're lying," Kimball said, but there was a fraction of uncertainty in it. "Go look," Gideon said. They went through this house in 10 minutes. He watched them do it from the yard with Kimball's eye on him and the cold moving through his coat. He could hear them inside, boots on the floor, doors opening, a lamp being lit. He thought about Clara moving through the snow to the south and willed that distance to grow. The man who came back out wore the expression of someone delivering news he knew was going to be poorly received. "Nobody in there," he said to Kimball. "Place has been lived in recent. Fire's still warm, food in the kitchen, children's things." Kimball turned back to Gideon. "She ran," Gideon said. "Smart woman. She saw your men coming and she ran. Without the children. She sent the children ahead." He said it like a man giving up information reluctantly, because that was how you made information sound true. "She knew she'd slow them down." Kimball sat on his horse and thought. Gideon watched him think and kept his face still and his breathing even. "Which direction?" Kimball said finally. "North," Gideon said. He was sending them the wrong way. It was a straightforward lie, and he knew it would only hold for an hour at most before they found the tracks going south. But an hour was something. Kimball looked at him for 3 full seconds. "If I find out you lied to me," he said, I'll be back." "I understand," Gideon said. Kimball turned his horse and called out to his men, and they began to reorganize, pulling back from the barn and the fence line, reforming on the road heading north. Gideon stood in his yard and watched them go with his rifle still lowered and his hands still visible, and did not move until the last of them had disappeared around the northern tree line. Then he went back inside, got his saddlebag, and started moving south. He caught up to Clara and the children at the edge of the Renstrom property line. Clara heard him coming and had the revolver up before he was close enough to identify himself, which was exactly right, and she lowered it when she recognized his shape and his voice. "They went north," he said. "We have an hour." "All of them?" "All 6. But they'll find the tracks." He looked past her at the children, who were standing in a cluster in the moonlit snow. Thomas pressed against Noah's side, Maisie still on Harriet's back, Samuel watching Gideon with the judicial attention he brought to everything. "Is anyone hurt?" "Cold," Clara said. "But no. Renstrom's house is a quarter mile. Can you make that?" "We've made worse," Noah said. "But..." Lars Renstrom opened his door before they knocked. He'd seen them coming across the open field. He'd been watching, as he'd said he would, and he had a lamp already lit and Ingrid already moving toward the kitchen before Gideon got through the explanation of what had happened. The children came inside with the careful, calibrated acceptance of people who had learned not to count on warmth until they were actually standing in it. And then Ingrid said something in Norwegian that was clearly "come here and sit down," and there were chairs and a fire and something hot on the stove, and the careful calibration dissolved faster than Gideon had expected. Maisie, who had said nothing in 2 weeks, looked at the fire and said, "It's warm." 2 words. Said to no one in particular, or to the fire itself. Clara heard it from across the room, and something moved through her face that Gideon looked away from, because it was too private to witness. He and Renstrom stood in the entryway. "Kimball had 6 men," Gideon said. "When they find the tracks going south, they'll come here. You need to know that." Renstrom's expression did not change in any dramatic way. "I know it," he said. "You don't have to..." "Hell." Renstrom's voice was plain. "My brother-in-law in Chateau has been listening in the saloon for a week. You know what people have been saying? That Victor Whitmore had a bounty hunter question the livery stable owner about whether any woman with children had passed through. That the livery man said no, and Whitmore's man called him a liar in front of 4 people. He paused. "People in this county have been living with Victor Whitmore's name over their heads for years. He's got a stake in the land office. He's got a man on the water commission. You know what he did to the Faber family 3 years ago?" Gideon didn't. Bought their mortgage when their bank went under and called it due in 60 days. In winter. Renstrom said it without anger, past anger, into something more settled and durable. "They lost the property, moved to Helena. The kids were in school here." He looked at Gideon steadily. "People remember that. They just haven't had a reason to say so until now." Gideon thought about what Clara had said, that Victor didn't know frontier neighbors the way he knew territory politics and money, that it was where they had something he didn't. "Adler wrote to the deputy marshal in Fort Benton," Gideon said. "Good. How long?" 2 weeks to 3. We need to stay out of Kimball's reach until then." "My place is defensible," Renstrom said simply. "You've got a wife and 4 children. My wife has shot a rifle since she was 12, and she's better at it than I am. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention that to her, because she'll be insufferable." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face briefly. "We'll manage." Perchad. Kimball found the southern tracks the next morning. He arrived at the Renstrom property line with 4 men. 2 had apparently been sent to cover other roads, and stopped there. Gideon watched from the Renstrom barn loft window and saw the deliberation happening at the fence line. Kimball on his horse, looking at the house, looking at the men around him, calculating. He had a writ for Clara and papers for the children. He did not have anything that covered walking onto Lars Renstrom's property and searching it. That was the thing about men who worked inside legal systems, even corrupted ones. They still needed the legal architecture. Kimball was a bounty hunter with documentation, not an outlaw. If he forced his way onto a property without cause, he opened himself to counterclaims that could void the whole operation. He sat at the fence line for 20 minutes. Then he sent 1 man to the door. Renstrom answered it himself. Gideon couldn't hear the exchange from the barn loft, but he watched it. Watched Renstrom's posture, which was the posture of a man standing fully on his own ground, and watched the messenger's posture shift over the course of the conversation in the way of someone who had expected less resistance. The messenger went back to Kimball. More deliberation. Then Kimball looked at the house for a long moment and turned his horse, and they rode south toward town. Renstrom came to the barn 10 minutes later. "He says he'll get additional paperwork," Renstrom said. "Search authority for associated properties. He said 2 days. "He's going to Helena," Gideon said. "That's what I think. 2 days to get there and back, assuming he pushes hard. Maybe 3. Gideon climbed down from the loft. "That's the window." "For what?" "For getting to Chateau and telling the story ourselves, before Victor can finish framing it." He looked at Renstrom. "Your brother-in-law in town. Can you get word to him tonight?" "I can ride myself," Renstrom said. "I need you here. Send Ingrid's brother a message. Tell him to go to the saloon, the land office, anywhere people talk, and start asking questions. Not about Clara specifically, about Victor Whitmore, about the Faber family, about the Water Commission, about what people know and haven't said." He thought about the papers Clara carried. "And I need a lawyer. Anyone in Chateau who isn't connected to Whitmore's money," Renstrom thought. "There's a woman," he said. "Newer in town, Martha Strand. She came from St. Paul 2 years ago. She's an attorney, one of the first women admitted to practice in the territory." He paused. "She's had some trouble getting clients because of it. Because she's a woman." "Because she's a woman," he confirmed. "Which means she doesn't owe Victor Whitmore anything." "Get word to her," Gideon said. Tell her we need to meet. Tonight if possible." Martha Strand arrived at the Renstrom house at 9 that evening, having ridden 9 miles in the dark, which told Gideon something about her before she'd said a word. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair cut practically short, and the particular directness of a person who had spent years having to establish their authority in every room they entered and had gotten efficient at it. She looked at Gideon, at Clara, at the children arranged around Renstrom's fire, and sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't curate it. Tell me the bad parts, too." Clara told her. All of it. Edmund, the children, Victor, the murder, the bounty, the 11 weeks. She laid the papers on the table as she went. The letters, the ledger copy, the writ. Martha Strand read each document as it appeared, making no comments, her face giving nothing away. When Clara finished, the attorney sat back and looked at the papers spread before her. "The letters are from Victor Whitmore in his own hand?" she asked. Edmund confirmed this handwriting. "I know it too. I've read his correspondence." "And the ledger page. You can establish chain of custody? That your husband copied this directly from Victor's office?" Edmund wrote a separate letter describing how he obtained it. "That letter is in Helena at our former house, with a neighbor I trust." Martha looked up. "You left evidence in Helena." "I didn't have time to collect everything when we ran. We'll need that letter." The attorney turned to Gideon. "The writ, the signature, Judge Vane. I know that name. He's been on the territorial bench for 4 years, and there have been questions about his appointments and rulings that nobody has pushed hard enough to examine." She turned the writ in her hands. "If I can show the judge who issued this writ is compromised, the entire legal basis for the bounty collapses." "How long would that take?" Gideon asked. "In a functioning legal system? Weeks?" She looked at him steadily. "In what we actually have? I don't know. It depends on who will listen and how fast." She paused. "The deputy marshal in Fort Benton. Adler's contact. What's his name?" "I don't know his name. Adler said he was Ruth Adler's brother." "Caleb Marsh," Renstrom said. "He's been with the marshal's service for 12 years. Martha wrote the name down. "If Marsh is clean, he can petition for an emergency review of the Vane writ on jurisdictional grounds. A territorial marshal has standing that I don't have alone." She looked at Clara. "And the children, Victor's guardianship papers. Do you have copies?" "No. He'll present them in court. We'll need to challenge them." The attorney was quiet for a moment, thinking through something complex that she was reducing to the simplest possible statement. "Here's what you need to understand. The legal case against you is real, even if it's built on fabricated evidence. Victor has done this carefully. He has a judge, a writ, a bounty, witnesses to a supposed marital argument, and now a bounty hunter with documentation. What we have She touched the letters on the table. Is better. But better doesn't automatically win. Better has to be heard. Then we make sure it's heard, Clara said. Martha looked at her for a moment. You understand that means going to Chateau. Formally. Not hiding. Clara didn't hesitate. Yes. Victor's men will be back here in 2 days with broader search authority. If we're going to get ahead of this, we go tomorrow. Martha looked around the table. At Clara, at Gideon, at Renstrom, at Noah, who had been sitting at the far end of the table the whole time, listening with the focus of someone who understood that this conversation was about his life and intended to follow every word of it. Tomorrow morning, early. I'll ride ahead, Renstrom said. My brother-in-law can start preparing people. Martha nodded. Don't prepare them to take sides. Prepare them to hear something they haven't heard before. She began gathering the papers carefully. People don't need to be persuaded to be angry at Victor Whitmore. They just need someone to tell them it's finally safe to say so. They arrived in Chateau the next afternoon. Not quietly. That had been Martha's instruction. Don't arrive quietly. Don't seem like people with something to hide. Arrive as people who are bringing something to the town rather than asking the town for something. Renstrom's brother-in-law, a hardware store owner named Carl Brandt, who apparently had more community standing than Gideon had realized, had spent the morning in conversation. By the time Clara and Gideon and the children came up the main road, there were people on the street who had heard enough to be curious, which was different from people who had only heard Victor Whitmore's version. The sheriff was a man named Ulrich, who was not corrupt. Gideon had always believed this on the evidence of 12 years of observation, but who was cautious in the particular way of men who had learned that powerful enemies were more expensive than powerful friends. He came out of his office when Gideon stopped in front of it, and he looked at Clara and the children and at Martha Strand, who had ridden up beside them. And his face did the calculation that Chateau officials had been doing for years whenever Victor Whitmore's name came into a room. Gideon, Ulrich said. Sheriff, Gideon said. This is Clara Whitmore. She's here voluntarily to respond to a writ that was issued in Helena by a judge with a documented conflict of interest in connection with a murder she didn't commit. He kept his voice even and public, loud enough for the people on the street to hear clearly. She has evidence. She'd like to present it. Ulrich looked at the papers Martha was holding. He looked at Clara. He looked at the children behind her, at the small, watchful faces that had been cold and hungry and running for 11 weeks. He looked at the people on the street who were listening. He made a decision. Gideon could see it happen. Not dramatically, but as a shift in the posture. The moment when a man who's been standing diagonally to something decides to face it straight. Come inside, Ulrich said. What happened in the next 3 hours was not a trial. It was something messier and more human than that. Clara laying out the evidence on Ulrich's desk while Martha guided her through it methodically. Gideon standing near the door, people from the town coming in and out in ones and twos as word spread. Ulrich asking questions that started skeptical and became something else as the letters and the ledger and the history of the bribes and the scheme accumulated in front of him. Carl Brandt came in at the second hour with a man Gideon didn't know, who turned out to be the former land office clerk who had processed 2 of the transactions on the ledger page and had left the position 8 months ago over what he described, with the careful language of a man who had been afraid to say it plainly, as concerns about the integrity of certain filings. His name was in the ledger. He recognized his own processing marks on documents that shouldn't have existed. He sat down and told Ulrich what he knew, and his hand shook while he said it. And when he finished, he looked like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down and is waiting to see if the ground will hold. Ulrich sent a telegram to Fort Benton at the end of the second hour. At the beginning of the third, Ward Kimball rode into Chateau. He saw the crowd outside the sheriff's office and stopped his horse in the middle of the street, and Gideon, watching from the doorway, watched Kimball understand what he was looking at. 6 men with a bounty hunter's authority were formidable against a single rancher on an isolated property. They were a different thing entirely in the middle of a town where the sheriff was inside going through documents and half the population was on the street watching. Kimball sat on his horse for a long moment. Then he turned and rode south, the way he'd come. Ulrich received a reply from Fort Benton the next morning. Caleb Marsh, Ruth Adler's brother, the deputy marshal who'd been in the service 12 years, was already en route. He'd received Adler's letter 4 days prior and had been in the process of making his own inquiries into the vain writ when Ulrich's telegram arrived. "He's bringing a territorial attorney," Ulrich told Gideon, "and something else. He said he'd located a witness." "What kind of witness?" Ulrich looked at the telegram in his hand. "He doesn't say. He says he located him 2 days ago. He says the man has a statement." Gideon brought this back to Clara and Martha, who were in the room Ulrich had arranged for them at the hotel. Clara received it with the expression she always wore when something better than expected happened. Not relief, not joy, but a careful, provisional attentiveness, like a person who has been disappointed enough times to be cautious about good news. "A statement about what?" she asked. "He didn't say," Gideon said. "Ulrich doesn't know." Martha was already thinking. If Marsh has a witness, a real one, and we have these papers and the former clerk, she paused. Victor is going to come himself. He won't send Pendleton or Kimball now. He'll come personally. "How do you know?" Gideon asked. "Because everything he's built is about control and authority," she said. "He'll believe he can walk in here and overwhelm it. He won't understand that the architecture has already changed." She looked at Clara. "He's never had to fight on ground he didn't choose. He won't know how." Clara was quiet for a moment. She was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed and Maisie was beside her, pressed against her hip, both of them looking at the window and the late afternoon light coming through it. "He killed Edmund," Clara said. "Not for the room. For herself, or for Maisie, or for whatever accounting she kept of the things that had happened. He killed him and told everyone it was me, and then he tried to sell 7 children. She turned to look at Martha and Gideon. "I want to make sure he doesn't get to do it again, to anyone." "That's what the trial is for," Martha said. "I know what the trial is for," Clara said. "I want to know it actually works." Martha looked at her with the directness she always carried, the quality that had made her a good attorney before she'd had clients to prove it on. "It doesn't always work," she said. "I won't tell you otherwise. But you have better evidence than most people walk into a courtroom with. And you have witnesses, and you have a deputy marshal coming who isn't in Victor Whitmore's pocket." She paused. "And you have Noah." Clara turned. Noah was in the chair in the corner where he'd been the whole conversation, and he looked up when his name came in. "What he witnessed," Martha said, "what he can testify to. A 15-year-old boy who was present when Edmund Whitmore was murdered, who can stand in front of a court and describe what he saw." She held Noah's gaze. "If he's willing." The room was quiet. Noah Reed sat in the corner chair with Edmund Whitmore's second rifle leaning against the wall beside him, and the serious eyes that had been serious since long before they had any right to be. And he said, "I've been willing since the night it happened. Nobody asked me before." Clara made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She looked at the boy. At this child who had come to her door at 2 a.m. with a plan to save 7 lives and had been executing it ever since. And her face did the thing it sometimes did that was past the control she kept so carefully, something that was too large for the room to fully contain. "Noah," she said. "I know what I saw," he said. "I'll say it in front of whoever needs to hear it." Outside the hotel window, Chateau went about its late afternoon business. Horses on the street, the distant sound of the smithy, the ordinary life of a small town that was in the process of deciding what it believed, which was always the slowest and most important thing any community ever did. Gideon stood in the corner of the room and looked at the people in it. The lawyer who had ridden 9 miles in the dark because someone needed her to, the rancher who had stayed because leaving felt like a different kind of dying, the woman who had pointed a gun at a stranger in a blizzard and put it down. The boy who had been carrying a murder in his memory for 3 months and was ready to finally set it down somewhere it could do some good. He thought about what Clara had said weeks ago at the kitchen table over cold coffee, that grief was just love with nowhere to go. He thought maybe he was starting to understand where it was supposed to go. Victor Whitmore arrived in Chateau 2 days later. He came with lawyers and writers and the particular bearing of a man who had never in his life walked into a room where he wasn't the most powerful thing in it. He did not look like a murderer. He looked like what he was, a wealthy, intelligent, well-dressed man in his 50s who had spent decades building something and intended to defend it. Gideon watched him arrive from across the street and thought that the most dangerous men rarely looked the part, which was why they stayed dangerous. Victor's lawyers went immediately to Ulrich's office. Victor himself stood in the street and looked at the town with the assessing gaze of a man taking inventory, and then he looked at Gideon across the distance between them. He didn't know who Gideon was yet. He was just a man on the street. But something in Gideon's stillness told Victor that he was looking at someone connected to what was happening here. And Victor looked back with the steady, measuring attention of a man who had identified an obstacle and was calculating what it would cost to move it. Gideon met his eyes and did not look away. Then Caleb Marsh rode into Choteau from the north, and behind him, in a buggy driven by a second marshal's deputy, was a man Gideon had never seen. But Clara had. She came out of the hotel behind Gideon and stopped on the step when she saw the man in the buggy. A man of about 40, with a brown beard going gray and a scar above his right eyebrow, and the look of someone who had been carrying something that was about to be taken from him. "That's the man from the blizzard," she said quietly. "The one I shot at." "The one who dropped the notebook," Gideon said. "He went to the marshal," she said. Something shifted in her voice. He went to the marshal and gave a statement. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't clean. A man who had been sent to hunt a woman and children had apparently been shot by her in a blizzard, lost his notebook, and spent the following weeks deciding that whatever Victor Whitmore was paying him was not worth what he'd been asked to be part of, and had gone to the nearest law he thought was honest and told them what he knew. People were complicated. Gideon had always believed that, and here was evidence. Victor Whitmore saw the man in the buggy and went still in the middle of the street, and the ground under everything he'd built began, very quietly, to move. The man in the buggy's name was Roy Decker. Caleb Marsh introduced him to Ulrich in the sheriff's office that same evening, with Martha Strand and Gideon and Clara present, and Decker sat in the chair across from the sheriff's desk with the posture of a man who has made a decision he knows he can't reverse and is trying to sit inside it without flinching. He had the scar Clara had described, above the right eyebrow, pale and old, the kind a man stopped noticing after a while, but other people always saw first. "You were employed by Victor Whitmore," Ulrich said. "For 3 years," Decker said. "Not exclusive. I did work for other men in the territory, but Whitmore was the main source of income." He turned his hat in his hands, a repetitive motion he probably wasn't aware of. What he paid well for was the kind of work most men won't put their name to. Meaning? Surveillance. Pressure. He paused. "I was in Helena the night Edmund Whitmore died." The room went very still. Clara was standing to Gideon's left, and he heard her breath change. Not loudly, but he was close enough that he caught it. The specific quality of a person who has been waiting 18 months to hear something said out loud. "Tell the sheriff what you told me," Marsh said. His voice was flat and professional, the voice of a man who had heard it already and was managing his own reaction carefully. Decker looked at his hat. "Victor Whitmore hired 2 men to go into the house. I was outside, keeping watch," he said. "Making sure no one came or went during—" He stopped. "During what he called a necessary correction." He looked up. Edmund Whitmore wouldn't stop. Victor had tried money, tried legal threats, tried having associates speak to him about the wisdom of letting certain things go. Edmund wouldn't. He kept pushing the territorial authorities about the children. Victor decided it was simpler to— He didn't finish the sentence. "And afterward?" Ulrich asked. Afterward, he told the story about Clara. He already had it prepared. The argument witnesses, the narrative. He told me it was handled. Decker set the hat on his knee. "I took my payment and I left. I told myself it wasn't my business what men did to their families." "And then you were sent after her," Martha said. 6 weeks later, when she'd been located in the Billings area, moving north with the children. He glanced at Clara briefly, then back at the hat. "I found them in a storm. She shot at me and I lost them in the dark." Another pause. "I was writing back to report when I stopped to think about what I was going to report. That I'd found a woman and 7 children sleeping in barns, eating when they could, running through a Montana winter, and I was going back to tell the man who'd had her husband killed so he could send those children to coal mines." He said it plainly, without drama, like a man reading a list of facts that had arrived at an inevitable conclusion. "I rode to Fort Benton instead." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ulrich looked at Marsh. "You have this in a signed statement?" "Witnessed and sealed," Marsh said. "Along with the names of the 2 men Victor hired, one of whom is currently in the Fort Benton jail on an unrelated matter and has been persuaded to corroborate. Ulrich sat back in his chair. He was a careful man, Ulrich. The caution that had frustrated Gideon for years was the same caution that made him thorough when he finally moved, and right now he was moving. Gideon could see the mechanism of it engaging behind the sheriff's eyes, all the pieces clicking into their proper positions. Victor Whitmore is currently at the Chateau Hotel, Ulrich said. Yes, Gideon said, with his lawyers. 2 of them. Ulrich stood. Martha, what does the law give me right now, tonight, with what I have in this room? Martha didn't hesitate. Marsh's federal standing gives you authority to detain on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. The signed statement from Decker and the corroborating witness in Fort Benton constitute sufficient probable cause. The writ against Clara was issued by a compromised judge. I can file an emergency challenge first thing tomorrow, and with Marsh's backing, it will hold. She paused. You have enough to arrest Victor Whitmore tonight. Ulrich put on his coat. Gideon did not go with Ulrich to the hotel. He stood in the street and watched the sheriff walk the 50 yards with Marsh beside him, and he stayed where he was because his presence would only complicate something that needed to be simple and official and clean. Clara stood beside him. Don't watch, he said. Not because he thought it would hurt her, but because he thought she'd already watched enough difficult things. I've been waiting 18 months, she said. I'm watching. So they watched. Together, in the cold street, with the hotel windows lit warm against the February dark. They saw Ulrich go in. They saw, 10 minutes later, 2 figures come out, Ulrich and a man between him and Marsh, whose posture had changed in the specific way that postures change when a person understands that the ground has shifted permanently beneath them. Victor Whitmore walked across the Chateau street toward the sheriff's office, and he walked like a man trying to maintain the bearing of someone in control of what was happening, and not quite succeeding. Gideon had seen that walk before, the walk of a man who has spent so long being the most powerful thing in the room that he hasn't developed a way of carrying himself when he isn't. Clara watched him pass. Victor looked at her, directly, the first time their eyes had met since before Edmund died, and something moved through his face that was complicated and dark and quickly controlled. Clara looked back at him without expression, not coldly, not with triumph, just with the clear, steady attention of someone who has nothing left to hide and has run out of capacity for anything other than the truth of what is. Victor looked away first. His lawyers were loud about it for the rest of the evening. They came to Ulrich's office within 20 minutes of the arrest, producing documents, citing jurisdictional objections, using the sharp-edged language of men who were paid specifically to make legal processes feel unstable for everyone but their client. Gideon listened to them from outside the office window, not because he could follow all the legal argument, but because the quality of the argument told him something about how worried they were. Loud lawyers were usually worried lawyers. Martha was inside, and she was not loud. She was the opposite of loud, precise, specific, responding to each objection with the kind of answer that had clearly been prepared not just for this moment, but for the whole category of moment, the years of practice that went into knowing which argument to make and which to let go. Gideon left them to it and went back to the hotel. Noah was awake when he came in, sitting in the chair he'd claimed in their shared room, the rifle still leaning against the wall out of habit. The younger children were asleep across 2 beds, arranged with the unconscious efficiency of children who had learned to share space. Harriet had gotten Maisie to sleep with her head on her own lap, and now Harriet was asleep too, and they were both still in that position, Harriet's hand resting gently on the little girl's back. It's done? Noah asked. He's in custody, Gideon said. The trial will take time, but he's in custody. Noah absorbed this with the stillness he always brought to important information. You think it'll hold? I think it has to, Gideon said, which wasn't quite the same thing, and Noah knew the difference but accepted it. I've been thinking about the testimony, Noah said. What I'm going to say. Gideon pulled the second chair to the window and sat. Tell me. I was in the kitchen when it happened, Noah said. He said it quietly, the way you said things that you'd been carrying a long time. Not with effort, because the effort was already spent, but with the flatness of something that had been turned over so many times it had gone smooth. I'd gotten up for water. I heard voices in the study. Edmund's and Victor's. Victor was saying the same things he'd been saying for months, about the children, about the scheme, about Edmund being a fool who didn't understand how the world worked. Mama says, he paused. Edmund told him to leave and not come back. He said he was going to the territorial governor's office in the morning, that he had documentation. Another pause. Victor said he wasn't going to let that happen. Gideon waited. Then there were sounds I didn't fully understand right away. It was fast. Victor called out for the two men he'd brought, and they came in from the front of the house. Noah's hands were flat on his knees, very still. I stayed in the kitchen. I know I should have. No, Gideon said. Noah looked at him. You were 13 years old, Gideon said. You stayed in the kitchen and you survived, and then you came to Clara at 2 a.m. and you saved 7 lives. Don't tell yourself a different story than the one that's true. Noah was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the town had gone mostly silent, the way small towns did late at night, settling into itself. Edmund told me once that the hardest thing about doing the right thing is that it doesn't feel like anything special when you're doing it. It just feels like the only option. He looked at the sleeping children. That's what 2 a.m. felt like the only option. That's what it was, Gideon said. They sat together in the quiet room for a while, two people of very different ages who had arrived at the same place by different roads, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which was the only kind that mattered. The trial was set for 3 weeks out, in Helena, before a different judge, one appointed at Marsh's insistence, a territorial bench member named Cowboy, who had a reputation for procedural strictness that cut both ways, which Martha said was exactly what she wanted. The 3 weeks in between were not peaceful. Victor's lawyers filed challenges to Decker's statement, to the admissibility of the letters, to the jurisdiction of the original arrest. They filed a counter-petition asserting Victor's guardianship rights over the children and requesting their immediate transfer to a court-appointed facility in Helena pending the trial's outcome. They made noise in the territorial newspapers. Victor Whitmore, grieving brother, philanthropist, land developer, subjected to a politically motivated legal persecution based on fabricated evidence produced by a known fugitive. Martha filed responses to each challenge. She worked from the hotel room she'd taken, at a desk that disappeared under papers by the end of the first week, sleeping 4 hours a night and eating whenever someone remembered to bring her food. Gideon brought her coffee twice a day, and she accepted it without looking up from whatever she was writing. The guardianship petition, she told Clara one evening. It's the one I'm most worried about. Because? Clara asked. Because legally it has surface plausibility. Victor is blood relation. The children's status is technically in question pending your own case's resolution. A judge inclined to caution could grant it temporarily. She looked at her papers. I need to establish that your guardianship, yours and Edmund's, was functional, documented, and in the children's best interest, in a way that makes any transfer look like harm rather than protection. How? Letters from people who knew you in Helena, teachers, neighbors, anyone who interacted with the children in your care over the years. She paused. Also the children's own statements, if they're willing and old enough to give them. Clara looked at the doorway where Celine had appeared with the farmer's almanac she'd been reading for 3 weeks, apparently in search of a quiet corner. Celine looked back at them both with the cataloging attention she brought to everything. I can write a statement, Celine said. Martha looked at the 8-year-old. About what? About what it was like at Edmund and Clara's house, Celine said. About what it was like before, where I came from. About the difference. She said it practically, without drama, the way she said most things. I can describe things accurately. Edmund said I noticed more than most people. Martha looked at Clara. She does, Clara confirmed. Then yes, Martha said to Celine. Write it down. Everything you remember. Don't try to make it sound important, just write what was true. Celine took the almanac back to her corner and found a piece of paper and began. The letter from Helena came 10 days before the trial. It was from the neighbor Clara had trusted, a woman named Vera Hollis, who had lived 2 houses down and had, apparently, been waiting for someone to ask her what she knew. The letter was 8 pages long, written in a cramped and urgent hand, and it contained the description of the document Martha needed. Edmund's own letter, The one he'd written explaining how he'd obtained the ledger copy, stored in a locked box under Vera's floorboards. Vera had also, on her own initiative, collected 3 additional letters from other Helena neighbors willing to speak to the quality of the Whitmore household and the welfare of the children in it. And she had located the school records for 4 of the children during their time in Helena, showing regular attendance, adequate nutrition based on the teacher's notes, general well-being. Martha read the letter twice and set it down with the expression of someone who has been building something in difficult conditions and has just received the last necessary piece. "Get word back to Vera Hollis," she told Clara. "Tell her to bring the box to Helena. Tell her to bring anyone else she can. Tell her the trial date." Clara wrote the reply herself at the hotel desk, and she wrote it carefully, not because she didn't trust her own words, but because she understood that some letters needed to be written with the same care you gave to something irreplaceable. They arrived in Helena 4 days before the trial. The city was different from Chateau, in the way that all capitals are different from smaller towns. More architecture, more noise, more layers of history compressed into a shorter space, the sense of consequence that comes from being the place where things are decided. Gideon had been to Helena twice before, and both times had been glad to leave. This time he found he didn't particularly care where he was, as long as the people around him were the same people they'd been in Chateau. They were. Noah had grown quieter as the trial approached, not in the way of someone retreating, but in the way of someone conserving something. He ate regularly, slept adequately, maintained his watch over the younger children with the steady attention that had never lapsed. But he was interior in a way he hadn't been before, working on something Gideon understood without asking to be about what he was going to say in that courtroom and how he was going to say it. The night before the trial, Gideon found him in the hotel corridor, standing at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the Helena street. "You don't have to do this alone," Gideon said. "I know," Noah said, "but I have to do it." "Yes. Is that what it always feels like? The right thing?" Gideon thought about it honestly because Noah deserved honest answers. Sometimes. Sometimes it feels like the only option, like you said. Sometimes it feels terrible, and you do it anyway. Sometimes you only know it was right afterward. He stood beside the boy at the window. Sometimes you don't know for years. Noah considered this. Edmund knew what he was doing when he kept documenting Victor. He knew it was going to cost him. Yes, and he did it anyway. "Because of those children," Gideon said. "Because some things are worth the cost." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you think he knew about me? That I'd be the one to carry it forward?" It was the kind of question that didn't have a provable answer, and Gideon didn't pretend otherwise. "I think he taught you everything he could," he said. "I think that means he trusted you to figure out the rest." Noah nodded slowly. He looked out at the street for another moment, and then he turned from the window and went back to his room, and his shoulders were straight. The trial lasted 4 days. Victor Whitmore's lawyers were excellent. That needed to be said plainly, because pretending otherwise would have been a dishonesty, and the trial was not a clean sweep, not a simple demolition of everything Victor had built. It was 4 days of hard, technical, sometimes exhausting argument in a courtroom that smelled of coal smoke and packed bodies, with a judge who kept both sides to their evidence and their procedure with a strictness that occasionally frustrated Martha, but, in the end, served what she needed. Victor himself sat at the defense table with the composure of a man who has decided that composure is his only remaining strategy. He was good at it. He answered questions from his own lawyers in the measured tones of a reasonable man falsely accused, and he absorbed Martha's cross-examination without visible cracks, redirecting each question back to the narrative his lawyers had constructed. A grieving brother, maligned, victim of a vengeful woman who had killed his brother and fabricated evidence to cover it. It was a good performance. Gideon, watching from the gallery, understood why the man had gotten as far as he had. Then the evidence arrived. Edmund's letters, the ledger copy, Decker's signed statement, the corroborating testimony from the second man in Fort Benton delivered via sworn affidavit that Marsh had obtained before the trial. The former land office clerk, Carl Brandt's brother-in-law in Chateau, and 2 other officials from separate counties who had received payments from Victor's operation and had, one by one, decided that the approaching weight of the case made silence more dangerous than speaking. And Vera Hollis, who had traveled 3 days from Helena to sit in that courtroom and describe in plain and particular language exactly what she had seen across 2 years as a neighbor to the Whitmore household. The children arriving, the state they were in, the state they were in afterward, Edmund's worry, Clara's work, the quality of a home built from conviction rather than obligation. Judge Calloway admitted everything. Victor's lawyers challenged each piece, and Calloway ruled on each challenge with the procedural precision Martha had counted on, and the challenges failed. On the third day, Noah took the stand. He walked to the witness chair the way he walked most places, with the unhurried attention of someone who knew where he was going and had decided to arrive there deliberately rather than fast. He sat down and looked at the courtroom without flinching. Martha took him through it carefully. His name, his age, how long he'd lived in the Whitmore household, what the household was like. She built the foundation slowly, giving the jury time to see who this boy was before she asked him to carry the weight of what he'd seen. Then she asked him about the night Edmund Whitmore died. Noah told it the same way he'd told it to Gideon in the hotel room in Choteau, plainly, without drama, with the flatness of something that had been turned over so many times it had gone smooth. The kitchen, the water, the voices in the study. Victor's voice saying, "I'm not going to let that happen." The sounds. The two men. He described the two men by their voices, by one physical detail each. A red kerchief on one, a specific pair of boots on the other. The man with the red kerchief was the man in the Fort Benton jail. The jury looked at the affidavit and looked at Noah, and the math was not complicated. Victor's lawyer cross-examined for 45 minutes. He tried 7 different approaches to unsettle Noah's account. The darkness of the kitchen, the distance from the study, the trauma of a young boy's memory, the suggestion that Clara had coached him in what to say. Noah answered each question with the same quality he brought to everything, complete, unadorned, impossible to mistake for rehearsal because rehearsal made things too smooth, and this was not smooth. This was a 15-year-old boy saying what he had seen, and it sounded exactly like that, which was worse for Victor than any dramatic performance could have been. At one point, the lawyer said, "Isn't it possible that what you heard was an argument that became violent between equals? That Victor Whitmore acted in a moment of passion rather than with premeditation?" Noah looked at him steadily. "He brought 2 men with him," he said. "He brought them into the house before the argument started. He left them in the front room while he went to the study." A pause. "You don't bring 2 men to a conversation." The courtroom was quiet. Calloway looked at the lawyer. "Next question," he said. "Jet." Celine's written statement was entered into evidence on the 4th day. Martha read portions of it aloud because Celine was 8 and Calloway had determined she was too young to testify directly, a ruling that Martha had not pushed against because the statement was, in some ways, more powerful read than spoken. It described in Celine's cataloging precise, entirely unsentimental language the difference between where she had come from and where she had been. It described food and warmth and the particular texture of being in a place where the adults noticed things about you specifically rather than generally. It described Edmund reading to her on Sunday evenings because he'd noticed she liked to read but couldn't always manage the harder words alone yet. It described Clara teaching Harriet to dress a wound because Harriet had said she wanted to be a doctor, and Clara had said, "Then you'd better learn the practical parts first." It did not editorialize. It did not say this was a good home or these were good people. It described objects and actions and sequences of events in the flat, accurate language of a child who noticed more than most people and had written exactly what was true. By the time Martha finished reading it, 2 of the jurors were looking at their hands. Victor's lawyers did not challenge it. There was nothing in it to challenge. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Gideon spent most of those hours in a corridor outside the courtroom, sitting on a bench with Clara beside him. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't been said over the 4 days of the trial or the weeks before it, and the silence between them had long since passed the stage where it needed to be filled. At one point, Clara said, "Whatever happens, don't," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Whatever happens is going to be what we deal with then," he said. "Right now we're waiting. Let's just wait." She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned slightly, not dramatically, just a degree or two, until her shoulder rested against his. And they waited. The verdict was guilty. Murder in the first degree. Conspiracy. fraud on the territorial court, the child labor scheme which had been added to the charges at Marsh's insistence based on the letters and the testimony of Aldous Crane in Butte, who had turned on Victor with the speed of a man who had been looking for an exit for some time. They announced it in the courtroom, and Clara sat very still, and Gideon watched her face, and what was on it was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more complicated. The specific look of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that when it's finally lifted, they don't immediately know how to stand without it. Victor Whitmore did not say anything when the verdict was read. He sat at the defense table with his composure finally fully intact, the way composure works when there's nothing left to protect behind it, and he looked straight ahead, and then the bailiff came to take him, and he stood, and he went. Gideon did not watch him go. He was watching Clara. After a moment, she exhaled, slowly, the kind of breath that has been held for longer than one conversation, longer than 4 days of trial, longer than 11 weeks of running, something that went back much further and had finally found its way out. "Edmund," she said quietly, to no one in particular or to the general fact of what had just happened. Just the name, just said. Gideon put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She turned her hand and held it. The guardianship ruling came 2 days later. Calloway had reserved that question separately, and Martha had spent the 2 intervening days filing the final arguments. The letters from Helena, neighbors, the school records, Vera Hollis's testimony, Celine's statement, the documented history of the household, the 6 months of evidence that Clara and Edmund had built something real and specific for those particular children. Victor's claim collapsed with his conviction. The territorial court found no basis for the counter-petition and dismissed it in full. Clara's guardianship, which had existed in fact for years, was formalized in writing by a judge who had sat through 4 days of testimony and had a clear understanding of what he was formalizing. Martha brought the papers to the hotel room and laid them on the table. Clara read them. Then she set them down and pressed both hands flat on the table and stood there for a moment with her head lowered. Then she straightened. "All right," she said. It was all she said. But the way she said it, the specific quality of those 2 words, contained everything that the preceding 18 months had cost, and everything that was going to come next, and the particular human experience of arriving at the other side of something you weren't sure you'd survive. Gideon thought it was the most complete sentence he'd ever heard. That evening, Maisie climbed onto Clara's lap while Clara was sitting by the hotel window, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that after a few minutes, Maisie looked up at Clara and said, in the quiet, considering voice of a child working something out, "Are we staying now?" Clara looked down at her. "Yes," she said. "We're staying." Maisie thought about this with the gravity she brought to important information. Then she settled back against Clara's chest with the absolute total relaxation of a small creature that has decided, finally, that the ground beneath it is solid. Gideon watched this from the doorway and felt something move through him that had no clean name and didn't need one. Noah appeared beside him, looking into the room. "Maisie's been quiet for almost 3 months, Noah said. "I know," Gideon said. "She talked more. And Helena. Before everything." He paused. "She'll talk more again." "She already is," Gideon said. Noah looked at the room, at Clara and Maisie at the window, at Harriet helping Thomas with something at the table, at Samuel in his corner conducting his eternal assessment of the available evidence, at James who was telling Celine something with his hands going fast the way they did when he was excited about a thing, at 7 children in a room that was warm, in a city where the man who had been hunting them was now in a cell, with papers on the table that said clearly and legally what had always been true. He looked at it all for a moment, then he said, "What happens now?" Gideon thought about the ranch, about the south fence that needed repairing again, about the 4 horses that had been managed inadequately in their absence and would be irritable about it, about the roof on the east side of the barn he'd been meaning to reinforce before winter fully set in, about a kitchen table that had held 7 children and their various catastrophes of hunger and fear and had turned out to be the right size for all of it, about a question Samuel had asked him weeks ago, whether permanent and now were the same thing, and the answer he hadn't had then that he was starting to find his way toward now. "We go home," he said. It was the first time he'd called it that since Margaret died. He noticed the shift the moment the word left him, the way certain words land differently than you expect. Not with nostalgia, not with sadness, but was something forward-facing and specific that felt, for the first time in 6 years, like an accurate description of an actual place. Noah heard it too. He looked at Gideon with the serious eyes that had been serious so long and said simply, "Yeah." And outside the hotel window, Helena went about its life, indifferent and ordinary, and entirely unaware that in one room on the second floor, 7 children and 2 adults were in the process of becoming something that the frontier didn't have a clean word for yet, but that everyone who saw it would recognize. They went home in the first week of March. The road back to the Hale Ranch took 2 days by wagon, which Renstrom had arranged for them in Helena, along with 2 additional horses and enough supplies to last a month. It was cold, but not brutal. The specific cold of late winter that carries in it the first faint suggestion that it won't last forever, the kind of cold that reminds you spring is a real thing even when you can't see it yet. The children rode in the wagon bed wrapped in blankets, and for the first time in longer than most of them could clearly remember, nobody was watching the road behind them. James watched the road ahead instead, with his chin up and his eyes moving over the terrain the way he'd learned to move them on the ranch, assessing, curious, planning. Thomas slept against Noah's shoulder for the first half of the first day, and Noah let him, his own eyes going over the landscape with the attention that had become habitual and would probably never fully leave him, but that was shifting in quality from vigilance to something more like appreciation. Harriet kept Maisie occupied with a game involving counting fence posts, which Maisie participated in with the growing verbal confidence of a child who had remembered that words were available and was making steady use of them. Celine read. Samuel watched everything and said little, which was his permanent condition, and which Gideon had come to understand was not detachment, but the particular form of engagement that suited him. Clara sat beside Gideon on the wagon seat for most of the second day. They didn't talk a great deal. There had been a lot of talking in Helena, in the courtroom, in the hotel room, with Martha and Marsh and Ulrich and Vera Hollis, who had made the trip from her neighborhood because she'd decided it was worth making. After all of that, the particular quiet of a wagon road through late winter Montana felt like something to be respected rather than filled. At one point, Clara said, "The ranch is going to need more space." "I know it," Gideon said. "James alone is going to require a separate barn within a year." James and the horses are already negotiating that arrangement between themselves. Clara's mouth curved. It was a small thing, the smile. She was still cautious with happiness in the way of someone who'd had it taken before, but it was real, and it was hers. Edmund used to say that the only thing you couldn't plan for was exactly how much room people would turn out to need. She looked at the road ahead. He was talking about the children. He said every one of them surprised him. "They surprise me daily," Gideon said. "Samuel told me this morning that he's decided you're trustworthy," Clara said. "He wanted me to know he'd reached a conclusion." Gideon considered this. "What criteria?" "He said you answer questions honestly even when the honest answer is uncomfortable, and you don't pretend to know things you don't know." She paused. "He said most adults fail at least one of those." "He's not wrong," Gideon said. "No," Clara agreed. "He rarely is." The wagon rolled on. The sky was the pale, washed blue of late winter, and the snow on the hills had started going granular at the edges, the way it did before the melt. And somewhere above a hawk was working the thermals with the easy patience of a creature that understood waiting. The ranch looked the same, of course it did. It had only been weeks, not years, but Gideon had half expected it to look different, the way places look different when you've been somewhere difficult and come back and see them with the eyes of someone who wasn't sure they'd return. The house was there. The barn was there. The fence lines ran where he'd put them, holding the shape of the property against the open country. James was out of the wagon before it stopped. He went straight to the barn, which Gideon had expected, and when Gideon followed him in a few minutes later, the boy was already talking to the horses in the low, specific murmur he'd developed. Not sweet talk, more like briefing, as if the horses needed to understand the current situation, and he was the appropriate person to explain it. "They're all right," James reported without turning around. "A little grumpy, the gray one especially." "The gray is always grumpy," Gideon said. "He needs more exercise than you give him." "He needs more exercise than I have time to give him," Gideon said. "That's a different problem." James turned and looked at him with the directness of a 12-year-old who has identified a solution. "I have time," he said. Gideon looked at the boy. at the squared-up certainty of him, at the hands that had fixed a hinge correctly on the first attempt, at the eyes that had been watching how this ranch operated since the second morning he'd been on it. "Yes," Gideon said, "you do, it." The work of returning took the better part of a week. Not the physical work of unpacking and resettling, though that was part of it, more the interior work of a household that had been compressed by crisis beginning to decompress, to find its actual shape rather than its emergency shape. Children who had moved in careful formation, always aware of exits and sounds, began to move differently. Not carelessly, some things don't fully unwire, and Gideon didn't expect them to, but with the particular looseness of people who no longer have to hold themselves in constant readiness. Harriet reorganized the kitchen within 3 days, a project she undertook with such complete authority that Gideon found himself asking her where things were rather than the other way around. She had opinions about where things should go that were, he had to admit, better than the opinions he'd had about it for 17 years. Thomas began following Gideon on his morning rounds again, and this time he started asking questions. Careful questions, specific ones, the kind that built on each other in a progression that told Gideon the boy had been storing observations for weeks and was now cross-referencing them against new information. He wanted to understand how the fence affected where cattle moved, and how that affected the grass, and how the grass affected what the ranch could support. And he asked about all of it in the quiet, methodical way of someone assembling a picture one piece at a time. Gideon answered every question fully. It was the only response that made sense. Celine found the map of Montana Territory above the fireplace and spent an afternoon studying it with the almanac beside her, cross-referencing something. When Gideon asked what she was doing, she said she was trying to understand how many children in the territory were in the same situation these 7 had been in. "Why?" he asked. "Because the problem doesn't stop," she said, with the flat accuracy of an 8-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion that most adults work hard to avoid. Victor is in prison, but whoever he was buying the children from and selling them to, those people are still there. And there are more children. Gideon looked at the map. "Yes," he said. "There are." Celine looked at the map too. "Someone should do something about it," she said. It was the kind of statement that children make and adults receive as a general moral sentiment and file away. Gideon didn't file it. He thought about it for the rest of the day and into the evening, and that night he told Clara what Celine had said. Clara was at the kitchen table with a letter she was writing to Martha Strand, who had gone back to Choteau and was, by her last communication, drowning in new clients, who had apparently decided that a woman attorney who'd won a murder case against Victor Whitmore was exactly who they wanted handling their affairs. Clara looked up from the letter. "She's right," Clara said. "I know she is. Edmund knew it too. That's why he kept going even when Victor came after him, because he understood that stopping was just agreeing to let it continue." She set down her pen. "I've been thinking about it since Helena, about what comes next, not just for these 7. Gideon sat down across from her. "Tell me." "Victor's estate," she said. "The conviction, the fraud charges, the conspiracy. There are asset forfeitures attached. Martha says the process takes time, but there will be significant recovery, and some portion of it comes back to the people harmed by his schemes." She looked at him directly. "Edmund and I were directly harmed. The children were directly harmed. Martha says our claim is among the strongest." Gideon had not thought about money. In the weeks of crisis, money had been the last thing on his mind. He thought about it now. "How much?" he asked. Martha doesn't know yet. Enough to matter." Claire's hands were flat on the table. "I want to use it for something specific. Not just—" She paused, working out the words. "Not just for us. Not just to be comfortable. Edmund spent 5 years building something for children who had nothing, and Victor destroyed it. I want to rebuild it, larger, with a structure that can't be destroyed the same way." Gideon looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had pointed a gun at him in his barn and put it down, who had walked a fence line with a bullet wound 3 days old, who had stood in a Helena courtroom and watched 18 months of fear and running come to something that looked, improbably, like justice. "What would that look like?" he asked. "A place," she said. "A real one. Not just a house that becomes a home by accident, like ours was. Something built for it, documented, legally established, with oversight that can't be corrupted by one man's money." She paused. A refuge for children across the territory who have nowhere. How many children are we talking about? As many as need it, she said simply. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He thought about 17 years on this land. About Margaret's flowers, the ones she'd grown because they were her own business. About the specific weight of a house that has had only one person in it for too long. About James in the barn, and Thomas on the morning rounds, and Samuel conducting his judicial assessments, and Maisie saying, "It's warm to the fire." About what Celine had said. Someone should do something about it. "We'd need more than this ranch," he said. Yes. Martha would need to set up the legal structure. She already said she would. She said it the day after the verdict, before I'd even asked. And you'd run it. Clara looked at him. "We'd run it," she said. "If you're willing." There was something in the way she said "we" that had been building since the wagon seat on the road home, since the kitchen table in Renstrom's house, since the cold conversation over cold coffee when she'd said the children go and he'd said, "That's understood." It had been building in the specific way that things built between two people who had been through difficult things together, not fast, not smoothly, but with the particular durability of something tested before it was finished. "I'm willing," Gideon said. Clara held his eyes for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and added a section to the letter to Martha. They called it Horizon Haven. The name came from Noah, who had been included in the planning from the beginning because excluding him would have been a dishonesty. He'd been in it from the start, and he would be in it for as long as it ran, in one form or another, and everyone who knew him understood this. He'd suggested the name without ceremony, in the middle of a planning discussion around the kitchen table, and when he said it, the room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when the right word arrives. "Horizon," Clara said. "Because it's always ahead of you," Noah said. "You never fully get there, but you keep going toward it." He paused, in the way he always paused before the most important thing. "And it means there's always something ahead." Martha filed the incorporation papers in April. The asset recovery from Victor's estate finalized in June, slower than expected and more complex than expected, because nothing in law moves at the speed anyone needs it to. The amount was significant, not unlimited, not a fortune by Eastern standards, but real. And real was what they needed. Gideon contributed a section of his land, the eastern portion that sat beyond the creek and had good southern exposure and had been doing nothing useful for 17 years except looking like potential. Construction began in July, when the ground was workable. Lars Renstrom came out 3 weekends in a row to help with the framing, bringing Carl Brandt's brother and 2 other Chateau men who had apparently decided that this was something worth showing up for. Ingrid brought food each time and managed the work of keeping 7 children from either helping too much or injuring themselves, which was its own category of skilled labor. Pete Adler rode over once, looked at what was being built, said nothing for several minutes, and then took off his coat and started working. By September, Horizon Haven had its first building, a main house, larger than the ranch house, with a kitchen built for actual numbers and a common room with a fireplace and sleeping quarters that could hold 16 children without anyone feeling crushed. The ranch house became the family home. Gideon and Clara and the original 7, who were no longer strangers to each other or to the land and who had stopped being surprised to wake up in the same place they'd fallen asleep. The first new child arrived in October. She was 6 years old and had been found by Caleb Marsh in a mining camp outside Butte, where she'd been living in circumstances that Marsh described in his letter with the careful language of a man choosing his words deliberately because the plain ones were too hard. Her name was Dora. She arrived with nothing, which was familiar, and she stood in the doorway of Horizon Haven and looked at the room and the fire and the children already in it, and she did not come in. Maisie went to the door. Maisie, who had been silent for 3 months and was now 5 years old and spoke in full sentences and had opinions about everything, went to the door and stood next to the new girl and looked at the room too, as if seeing it from the outside again. "It's warm," Maisie said, "and there's food. It's real." Dora looked at her. "I know it doesn't feel real yet," Maisie said, with the authority of expertise. "It does later." Dora came in. Years passed. Not smoothly. Nothing about running Horizon Haven was smooth, and anyone who told the story later and made it sound otherwise was leaving out the hard parts, which were considerable. There were children who arrived too damaged for anyone to reach quickly, and the work of reaching them anyway was slow and sometimes heartbreaking and occasionally failed. There were funding gaps in the years when the legal recovery money was exhausted and donations from territory supporters weren't enough, and Gideon sold 2 sections of land he'd been keeping as reserve. There were bureaucratic battles with territorial officials who had varying levels of interest in maintaining proper oversight of children's welfare and varying levels of susceptibility to the residual influence of men who had benefited from the old arrangement. Martha fought those battles mostly. She had moved her practice to Choteau and then, as her reputation grew, to Helena, and she had become over a decade the kind of attorney that other attorneys consulted when a case was difficult, which was a reputation built specifically on the work she'd done around Horizon Haven and the legal architecture she'd established to protect it. She had never married by choice and had strong opinions about anyone who suggested this was a deficiency rather than a preference. Noah Reed left when he was 18. He left to study law in St. Paul, a path that Martha had identified and that Gideon and Clara had funded with money they didn't entirely have and did not hesitate to spend. He came back to Montana 4 years later, passed the territorial bar, and joined Martha's practice for 3 years before opening his own office in Butte, which was the city that had the most need for what he'd decided he was going to do, which was represent children in custody disputes and guardianship cases and the various legal situations that arose when powerful people decided that children without advocates were convenient resources. He was exceptionally good at it. Not because he was naturally talented, though he was, but because he understood from the inside what the stakes were. He came back to the ranch every summer until he was 30, and occasionally after that, and when he came, he always spent time in the common room of Horizon Haven with whatever children were currently in residence, talking to them not about his work or his credentials, but about whatever they wanted to talk about. He understood that what children who had been discarded needed was not demonstrations of success. It was evidence that someone like them had kept going, which was a different thing entirely. James became a horse trainer of some regional reputation. He stayed on the ranch longer than anyone expected until he was 22, and then he took a job with a stock operation in Wyoming and wrote letters that were infrequent but always specific, always about horses, always containing at least one detail that made Gideon laugh. He came back for the 10th anniversary of Horizon Haven with a wife named Louise and a 2-year-old who had her father's fidgety energy and was going to be the same kind of exhausting and wonderful. Harriet became a doctor. She was the one who had told Celine at age 10 that she wanted to be, and Clara had taught her to dress wounds, and she had not deviated from the path once in the following years. She studied in St. Paul, same city as Noah, same year, which led to a long and complicated friendship between them that alternated between warm and combative depending on the season, and which both of them valued more than they consistently admitted. She practiced in Choteau for 2 years, and then in Helena for the rest of her working life. And the children she treated received the specific quality of care that comes from a physician who remembers being a patient in every important sense of the word. Celine went east, all the way east, to Boston, to a university that had recently begun admitting women into its degree programs with notable reluctance, and Celine had never found reluctance particularly convincing. She studied political science and philosophy and came back to Montana with ideas that some people found alarming and others found necessary, and she began writing about the legal status of children in Western territories with the same flat, accurate, catalog precision she had brought to everything since she was 8. Her work eventually contributed to legislative changes. She never entirely lost the habit of quietly inventorying rooms. Thomas became a rancher. He bought a small spread outside Choteau with money he'd saved from years of work, and he ran it with the same quiet, methodical attention he'd brought to following Gideon on morning rounds at age 9. He was not a man who needed a great deal of acknowledgement, which was probably why he was good at the work, which gave very little. He was a good neighbor. He showed up when people needed help and didn't make a performance of it. Samuel, who had reserved all judgment until further evidence was available, became a judge. This was not something anyone had specifically predicted, but in retrospect made complete sense. He had been conducting assessments of the available evidence since he was 7 years old. He had the particular quality of mind that could hear an argument and evaluate it against what was actually true rather than what was convenient. He served on the territorial court for 20 years and was known for rulings that were sometimes surprising and always explicable, and for the specific ability to sit with complexity without resolving it prematurely, which was rarer in a judge than it should have been. Maisie took over Horizon Haven, not immediately, not all at once. She grew into it over years, the way people grow into the things that were made for them. She had Clara's directness and something of Gideon's patience and a specific quality that belonged entirely to herself, which was the capacity to make a child who had been told they were nothing feel, within a relatively short time, like someone particular and worth knowing. She ran Horizon Haven for 30 years after Clara and Gideon stepped back, and under her direction it expanded twice and established 2 satellite locations in other parts of the territory, and the number of children who passed through it over those decades was somewhere in the hundreds, though Maisie was characteristically uninterested in the count. "What matters," she said once to a newspaper correspondent who had come to write about the operation, "is not how many. It's whether each one knew that someone saw them specifically, as themselves, not as a problem, not as a charity case, as a person." She said it simply, the way she said most things. The correspondent wrote it down. Gideon and Clara were married in the spring of 1888, 14 months after the blizzard. The ceremony was small and practical, which suited them both. Ulrich was there, and Adler and Ruth, and the Renstroms, and Martha, who had ridden from Chateau and brought a bottle of something excellent that she declined to explain the provenance of. All 7 children were there, arranged with varying degrees of formal patience. James had already lost the thread and was examining something on the ground outside the window, while Samuel was watching the proceedings with the focused, judicial attention he brought to everything, apparently building a record. Afterward, when the official part was done and the food was out, and the conversation had dispersed into the comfortable noise of people who had been through things together, Gideon found himself standing at the edge of the room watching it all. Clara appeared beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, because that was always what she asked for and what he tried to give. "I'm thinking about Margaret's garden," he said. "She grew flowers because the vegetables were obligation and the flowers were her own business. I spent 6 years after she died thinking I understood that. I don't think I did until recently." Clara waited. "The flowers weren't recreation," he said. "They weren't indulgence. They were the thing she did that was about what she wanted the world to be, rather than what it was." He looked at the room, at the children and the neighbors and the particular specific life that had assembled itself around a barn and a blizzard and a woman who'd put a gun down. "I think she would have understood all of this." Clara looked at him with the directness that had never softened. "She sounds like she would have been formidable," she said. "She was," Gideon said. "You would have argued constantly." "Probably," Clara agreed without any particular regret. They stood together at the edge of the room and let the life of it happen around them. And it was not perfect. It was better than that. It was real, with the noise and the mess and the particular grace that comes from people who have decided to be in the same place together and mean it. There is something that gets missed in the stories people tell about survival. The stories tend to stop at the moment of rescue, or the verdict, or the point where the danger is past. And those moments matter. They matter enormously, as anyone who has waited for them can tell you. But survival is not the same as living. And what happened on the Hale Ranch and what grew from it was not a survival story. It was a living story, which is slower and harder to tell and doesn't have a clean endpoint. The truth is that 7 children who had been discarded became people who spent their lives making sure fewer children were discarded after them. Not because they were extraordinary, or not only because of that, but because someone had looked at them at the right moment and decided they were worth the trouble. That decision had cost real things: comfort, safety, money, years. It had asked more of everyone involved than anyone had signed up for. But the asking was also the thing. Gideon Hale had spent 6 years alone on a property that was beautiful and that he was wasting, in the specific way that people waste things when they can't figure out what they're for anymore. He had not known what he was for until a woman pointed a gun at him in a blizzard and then put it down, which was an act of trust so costly and so specific that it required something equivalent in return. Clara Whitmore had spent 18 months running from a story that someone else had written about her, carrying evidence that the real story was different, finding out that the truth needs infrastructure, needs people and time and someone willing to stand in a sheriff's office and say this is what actually happened out loud, in a room where it can be heard. What they built together was that infrastructure. Horizon Haven was not a building or a legal entity or a charitable institution, though it was all of those things. It was the answer to what Victor Whitmore had tried to do. The counterargument, made not in words but in the lives of the children who passed through it and went on to be the people they went on to be. It didn't fix everything. It was never going to fix everything. The frontier was large and the need was larger than any one place could meet. And Celine's flat, accurate assessment at age 8 remained true for years and decades after. The problem doesn't stop, but the point, the thing that Edmund Whitmore had understood and had tried to build and had died for, and that Clara had carried forward in his absence, was never to fix everything. It was to do the part you could reach, to see the 7 people in front of you and decide that they were your business. To let that decision cost what it cost without deciding the cost was too high. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that love conquers all, or that justice always wins, or that good people are rewarded for being good. None of those things were reliably true, and anyone who had lived on the frontier for more than a season knew it. The lesson was simpler and harder, that what you do with what is in front of you is the only thing you ever actually control. The blizzard comes when it comes. The stranger shows up wounded in your barn, or she doesn't. And the question, the only question, really, underneath everything, is what you do next. Gideon had opened the door. That was all. That was everything. On a September morning in 1901, Gideon Hale sat on the porch of his ranch house and watched the Horizon Haven main building across the yard, where he could hear children. Not specifically, just the ambient noise of children somewhere in the vicinity of morning, which was a sound he had not had for the first 51 years of his life and had not been without for the last 14. Clara came out with coffee and sat in the other chair, which was her chair now in the way that things become yours through years of use, and they sat together in the September morning and listened. From across the yard came a sound, a child laughing at something, a short burst of pure, uncomplicated sound, there and gone. Gideon thought about a blizzard in February 1887, about gunshots near a barn, about a woman in an oversized coat holding a gun with a two-handed grip that didn't waver, about 7 children pressed against a wall in the dark, about Maisie saying it's warm to a fire, and later to a new child at a door, about Noah on a witness stand saying you don't bring 2 men to a conversation, about Samuel informing Clara that he had reached a conclusion about Gideon's trustworthiness, which Samuel apparently considered information worth passing along, about Margaret's garden and the difference between obligation and what you wanted the world to be. He drank his coffee. She's doing well, Clara said. She meant Maisie, who had taken on more of the operational running of Horizon Haven over the past year as Clara had stepped back. The Dora girl, the one who arrived last month, Maisie had her talking in 4 days. Maisie could get a stone talking, Gideon said. She learned it somewhere, Clara said, which was the kind of thing she said occasionally, with the specific tone of someone making an observation that contained more than it appeared to. He looked at her. She was 61 years old, and the dark hair he'd first seen plastered flat against her face in a lantern-lit barn had gone mostly gray, and the directness in her eyes had never changed by a single degree in 14 years. She was not easy. She had never been easy. She had opinions about everything and the capacity to be wrong about some of them, and the willingness, when presented with evidence, to revise, which was, in his experience, the rarest combination of qualities in any person. Clara, he said. What? Nothing, he said. Just your name. She looked at him with the look that meant she knew exactly what he meant, and was choosing not to make anything of it, which was its own form of communication. They sat together on the porch while the September morning did what September mornings did, and the sounds from Horizon Haven continued, the ordinary sounds of children in a place where they were safe, which were the most extraordinary sounds he knew. 14 years ago, Gideon Hale had walked through a blizzard toward gunshots in his barn and made a decision that cost him his isolation and his peace and his certainty about what his life was going to be. He had never once wished it otherwise, not because the cost had been small. It hadn't. Not because everything had gone right. It hadn't always. But because the question of what you were for had an answer now. And the answer was specific and had faces and names and had grown beyond what he'd been able to imagine on that frozen night and was still growing and would keep growing after him, which was the only kind of legacy that meant anything. The sun came fully over the eastern hills and the light moved across the snow on the high ground in the way he'd been watching it move for 28 years, briefly brilliant and then ordinary, the way good things often were. Gideon Hale sat on his porch and watched it, and was not alone.